Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 321. It's the last Sunday of the month, so of course this is the Patreon Drydock, and as such this is part 1 because there are plenty of questions. Robert Hilton asks, following up to Drydock 313 with a question on the Germans retaining their submarine design knowledge through extra-national design bureaus, between the wars, did the Germans attempt to sponsor or exchange their surface ship designers and or naval service engineering officers to work in bureaus or major shipyards of other countries? And if they didn't, was it something that, in your opinion, they could have benefited from? Not to any degree that I'm aware of. Of course, they did do some consulting work for navies like the Dutch, when the Dutch were looking at getting a battle cruiser or two later on in the interwar period. But you've got to bear in mind there are lots of obviously different types of surface warships. So for destroyers, they could design those in-house because the German Navy was allowed to have destroyers. They essentially could maintain design skills for anything up to a 10,000-ton ship because, again, the German Navy was allowed to have ships of up to 10,000 tons, albeit on a somewhat irregular basis because they were replacing the pre-dreadnoughts. And the cruisers, as we know with the Leipzigs and Königsbergs, etc., they were much smaller. So they were able to maintain a certain degree of surface ship design capability for the smaller vessels. The real problem was when it came to the larger vessels. I mean, even with the 10,000-ton ships, the Panzership, as you can see here, they are kind of heavy cruisers. They are best called heavy cruisers, but they're not heavy cruisers in the same vein that what everybody else was building. And of course, if you want to do anything larger like a capital ship or an aircraft carrier, then, well, you're fresh out of luck because the Versailles Treaty says you can't do that. The problem with sending those ship designers off to study elsewhere is, one, the number of shipyards, etc., that are actually designing capital ships are very small. And two, if a random bunch of Germans show up and say, hello, we would like to work for you to design battleships, people are going to get very suspicious very quickly. Whereas if you send a bunch of your submarine designers over to the Netherlands and they open a submarine design bureau, that's somewhat less suspicious because, hey, a bunch of people in the Netherlands happen to speak German and there's no restrictions. Well, there are some restrictions, but there's no restrictions, broadly speaking, on designing and building small submarines. And then, of course, you've also got the limits on capital ship construction. So no one is going to be accepting German designers in the very beginning of the 1920s when you've got the ships that were cancelled by the Washington Naval Treaty and then ships like the Nelson class or the Lexington class carrier conversions being designed. And then after that, the next opportunity is when everybody starts drafting up what they might be doing in the early 1930s when the Washington Naval Treaty 10-year rule expires. But again, that's a very limited number of design bureaus who are going to be desperate to keep as much in-house local talent active as possible. So they're not going to be taking foreign ship architects on, even if there weren't the security and suspicion issues surrounding that. And even with smaller ships, if they had wanted to get experience with foreign construction of cruisers and destroyers and so forth, again, those foreign shipyards and design bureaus had a relatively small staff because of this treaty restriction. So again, they would be mostly trying to keep on their existing local staff more than anything else. Whereas again, with the submarine design bureaus, you kind of set up your own shadow bureau and then you can employ as many people as you want. Plus, of course, submarines were one of the few remaining warship types in the interwar period, apart from destroyers, that actually had quite a wide customer base. Of course, if all of these things could be hand-waved away and German designers could go and observe or learn from various ship design bureaus as they try to comply with the treaty restrictions, that would help them, obviously keep them up to date with the latest innovations, but only to a limited extent, because obviously for one thing, once the Kriegsmarine really starts rebuilding, they start ignoring the treaty limits entirely, so a lot of those lessons would be lost. And also certain things about how you balance the weight of a ship versus its various components. So, how much weight do you devote to armament? What kind of secondary armament do you have? What kind of armor scheme do you adopt, etc.? Some of those things you might learn a lot, but the lessons might not actually be worth all that much once you get back to Germany. For example, if Germany doesn't have a useful dual-purpose weapon that can be mounted at sea, then learning all about dual-purpose weapons was a bit pointless. And if everybody's insisting on still using Krupp guns, which means sliding block breech loaders, which means brass cartridges, which means massive inefficient turrets, then learning how to do nice, efficient, small turrets with interrupted screw breech blocks is also a bunch of wasted knowledge. Unless, of course, you can somehow persuade Krupp to get with the program. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School training vessel Harakaze asks a two-part question regarding the film Sink the Bismarck. The first Sea Lord is wearing his medal ribbons on the left side as normal, but he's wearing a single award of some sort just under the lapel on the right. What would that be, and who awarded it? And separately, in both the First Sea Lord's office and the office of the ACNS, there are two photographs in frames clearly visible, with one being some sort of large capital ship and the other being a destroyer or cruiser. Can you identify both ships in those pictures and describe what they did? So this is actually an example of both very well-researched costumes, but also very slight errors in costuming. So back in the day, the First Sea Lord at the time, this obviously being Sir Dudley Pound, saved someone from drowning. Now, for this, he was awarded the Bronze Medal of the Royal Humane Society, but, at least under British terminology, non-state civil and humanitarian awards are worn on the right, instead of your regular stuff, which would be worn on the left, as you can see, which he is doing. So someone has clearly done their research for this film by making sure that he is actually wearing this single medal bar on his right-hand side as well. However, as I said, there has been a slight mess-up, because you'll notice that this one has a couple of distinct colour bars on either side, as well as a central one. The bronze medal ribbon is a solid blue, so it should just be a single one. This appears to be the bar for the Stanhope Gold Medal, which is the top-tier medal awarded by the Royal Humane Society. So it is a Royal Humane Society medal, but it's just about the wrong one for Dudley Pound. So if you compare and contrast this actual picture of him wearing said bar, you can see the actual one he was wearing in real life is pretty much a solid blue. Now, as for the ships on the wall, in the First Sea Lord's office, the large capital ship you can see just over his head there, if you zoom in, is absolutely a King George V class battleship, and from the relatively uncluttered nature of the superstructure, I'm pretty sure that's either King George V or Prince of Wales. I mean, that would make sense for the time period it's set in, although obviously department errors in the film may have put Duke of York, Anson or Howe in, but the fact it's got a very distinctive bar-type radar atop the superstructure and not a lot else means it's definitely not a late war photo, so that would suggest either King George V or Prince of Wales. Now, I've got one or two photos of King George V that are very similar, but not quite the same view, albeit obviously this is viewed at an angle, so there may be a little bit of distortion involved. And the last picture is an interesting one, because it's supposed to be the picture of the ship that was sunk under him by ships under the command of Admiral Lutjens. However, that is not the correct ship. It is a tribal class destroyer, as I'm sure many of you will have recognised. And the interesting thing is that, Shepherd, the new ANCS, is supposed to have had his ship sunk under him the previous year, obviously the film being set in 1941, off of Norway. And two tribal class were indeed lost off of Norway, Afridi and Gurkha. So in theory it could be either one of those, but both of those were sunk by air attack, not by ships. The only ship that was sunk by German ships under the direct command of Admiral Lutjens was HMS Glowworm, which also, to be fair, was sunk off of Norway in 1940 by the cruiser Admiral Hipper, but this isn't a picture of Glowworm. And of course Glowworm's captain was killed in the attack on Glowworm. ACC asks, which real-life naval procurement officer or department was the most Albonian, a term from Forgotten Weapons referring to an officer, department, or country that put together something that looked good or at least justifiable on paper, but was secretly sabotaging the war effort. The US interwar decisions to save money by not wasting any of those fantastic and expensive Mark 14 torpedoes in testing certainly comes to mind, but are there contenders who beat them in Albonianness? Well, for obvious reasons, there's relatively few examples, if any, of people who get up to the level of procurement officers or whole departments that are actively, deliberately sabotaging the war effort, but inferring from the second part of your statement with referring to the Bureau of Ordnance and the Mark 14s, people who are sort of accidentally sabotaging the war effort by being stupid, that opens the field up considerably more. While the Mark 14 is somewhat difficult to beat given the sheer impact it could have had the thing actually worked, there are a few other examples where someone was absolutely insistent that this would be a good idea, but it turns out it really, really wasn't and actively made things a lot worse. So, for example, the person in charge of developing the Royal Navy's destroyer armament for its at least large destroyers, so tribals onwards, in the middle of the 1930s, because they were absolutely convinced that air attacks would only happen in the context of a large fleet, and that said air attacks would concentrate purely on the large capital ships, and therefore using the 4.7-inch gun with minimal high-angle elevation was perfectly acceptable because the destroyers would naturally never come under significant air attack themselves, and so just being able to lob shells in the direction of another larger ship was fine in the anti-aircraft role, and the tiny amount extra of firepower that you got for having a 4.7-inch gun was in anti-surface action was therefore a good idea. Now, bearing in mind that the 4.5-inch, which you'd see on various British ships, but notably Ark Royal and Queen Elizabeth Valiant Renown, etc., was being developed and came into service at pretty much the same time that the Tribals entered service, and of course was a far superior weapon for anti-aircraft use, and really not all that far off the 4.7 in an anti-surface use either. You could argue that whoever that person was pretty much sabotaged a lot of the British war effort, because if the Royal Navy had standardized on the 4.7-inch, even if only for its destroyers, then a lot of fairly large, expensive and capable British destroyers might not have been lost in the early part of the war, and going forward, if a dual-purpose 4.5 with high-angle mounting is the go-to weapon as they build all the wartime flotillas, then of course they will all have it as well, instead of having to wait for the C-type later in the war to have proper full anti-aircraft capability in their destroyer main armament. And actually, staying on a British theme, you could probably also make a good case for the officers-departments in charge of late 1930s procurement. As the purse strings are beginning to come loose and rearmament is starting in earnest, there's still a small echelon higher up who are desperately trying to salvage some part of what is clearly a defunct naval treaty system, and, for example, are resisting calls to build new heavy cruisers or to expand the production of large light cruisers, like derivatives of Belfast and Edinburgh, for instance, and are still absolutely trying to stick to the limits of the old London Naval Treaty, hence why you get continued variations on the Fiji or Crown Colony class of 8,000 tonners. And it's a thoroughly, thoroughly stupid position, because their entire raison d'etre is, well, other people might adhere to this thing they're not legally obliged to adhere to if we lead by example. Firstly, no nation on the planet is going to adhere to a treaty it doesn't actually legally have to, especially if international pressure from the big powers who might enforce it is off. And secondly, no nation has ever managed to persuade another nation to reduce its armament spending by leading by example. In international politics, that's called weakness, and it gets exploited, not imitated. Salami Sales Express asks, I work in heavy industry as an electrician. I recently toured Battleship New Jersey and was impressed at just how recognizable the naming and numbering schemes were for identifying electrical panels and associated equipment. For example, you may find a lighting breaker panel labelled LP123, lighting panel 123, with another label stating fed by PP789CK3, which stands for Power Panel 789 Circuit 3. It led me to wonder how much warship engineering and design had helped the engineering practice as a whole when it comes to standardizing equipment identifiers and maybe even symbology on various drawings. Now, I don't know the details precisely because, as I said, I'm a naval historian. The interface between ships and the land-based side of things in terms of who influences what is a little bit of a fuzzier area of study for me. However, from broad principles and also looking back to even the era before electricity, there is generally a fair degree of influence, at least in nations with large navies, by said navy on how things are standardized on land, mostly because for a very long period of time, a large warship, so a ship of the line or a battleship, would be the single most complex technical achievement that a nation could build. Now, of course, you could build a much larger scope technical achievement, like, say, a full railway network or an underground system or something like that. But that's something that's made up of lots of individual parts, whereas a ship is just, it's one thing. It either is a ship or it is not complete. And there wasn't really an equivalent in terms of structures and so forth until the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. And so, given that ships started to be electrified in the 1870s with mixed results, and then going on forward into the 1880s and 1890s, given just how much electrical wiring and hydraulic power and so on and so forth that would be required in one place in a ship, probably at levels that would be pretty much unmatched except by things like really major mines or some of the bigger factories. And bearing in mind, in the Victorian period, even in the latter part of the century, a lot of factories were still working off the old central spindles and flybelt systems rather than electricity. You're probably going to end up with, again, at least nations with large numbers of warships, probably having the single largest amount of standardization for those electrical components and so forth being naval use, which of course means that's a big customer. And if a company is then making these things and or slightly different products and selling them elsewhere, well, they've already got a pre-established pattern on how to label things. Plus, of course, a lot of the labeling has to be understood by sailors who may not have had much in the way of education, but are expected to be as in like secondary school type education, but are expected to be operating fairly complex equipment. So not only does it have to be quite standardized, it also has to be fairly easy to comprehend. Like you said, PP for power panel, CK for circuit, LP for lighting panel, and so on and so forth. So I suspect there's a fair degree of influence, but of course, if anyone's done more research into that field, please feel free to say so in the comments below. Jeffrey Connolly asks, had USS Olympia been built as an armoured cruiser instead of a protected cruiser, would she still have been sent to the Pacific during the Spanish-American War, and could her being an armoured cruiser have had an effect on whether she was scrapped or preserved as a museum ship? It definitely would have affected things, and I don't think she'd still be around today, because at the time of the Spanish-American War, the US had exactly 3 armoured cruisers. Well, more specifically, they had 2. They started out with 3, but the whole catalyst for the thing was Maine exploding, so that left them with 2. And since the majority of the Spanish heavy ships deployed overseas were in the Caribbean area, therefore the heaviest US ships had to concentrate there. That meant, of course, the battleships, such as they had, but also the armoured cruisers, because a number of the Spanish vessels were armoured cruisers, and there was a potential that the Spanish armoured cruisers could therefore outrun the US pre-dreadnoughts. And thus, if Olympia was, well, given the date of her construction, she would have been the first armoured cruiser instead of Maine, then she would have had to have been present in the Caribbean as well. Additionally, she would have probably looked something like Maine, i.e. very heavily overgunned and somewhat slow. And assuming that it's not Olympia that blows up instead of Maine, then if she survives, she doesn't have the kudos of being a flagship on a foreign station, because, as I say, almost certainly she would have been kept in the Caribbean with Brooklyn and New York, the other two heavy cruisers that were around at that point. Now, surprisingly, the US kept both of its surviving historical armoured cruisers, the early ones, that is, opposed to the latter ones they built in the 1900s. They kept them around for a good long while. One of them actually only went out of service in the late 30s. The other one went with the Washington Naval Treaty. But if Olympia was just one of 3 late 19th century armoured cruisers, then yeah, she would have potted about in World War I doing a few bits and pieces. But as the oldest, she almost certainly, without that kudos of being the flagship for the Battle of Manila Bay, would have ended up just being decommissioned and scrapped in the late 1910s or early 1920s to make up room for tonnage for more modern vessels. Ulf Axelsson asks, how were the West Indies squadrons or fleets of the Royal Navy actually organised during the classic 1750 to 1850 period? Were they based in the port of Spain, Jamaica, Antigua, the Bahamas, Halifax? I assume it changed over time. Well, during that time period, the designations the Royal Navy used changed quite a bit. At the start, so 1750, of at least the period the question is asking about, you had separate stations for the Caribbean, known as the Jamaica Station, another one for North America, the initial part, obviously, that being the colonies, which was the North America Station, and then you had the Newfoundland Station, which basically looked after the areas that were, roughly speaking, Canada, or would become Canada. As time went on, that changed. So obviously, when the American colonies became the United States of America, then you couldn't base Royal Navy warships in Boston or wherever, for example. And so you had then the North America and Newfoundland Station. It went through a few various iterations, but essentially after the American independence, but before 1850, there were a series of amalgamations. So firstly, the stations off North America and off Canada would eventually become merged. It wasn't an immediate thing. And then towards the end, in the 1830s, you had the North America and West Indies Station, which merged pretty much everything from Canada all the way down to the Caribbean. During the 1750 to 1850 period, the 2 main bases that the Royal Navy used were Halifax, which was the oldest of the bases that they'd used, mostly because it was a good harbour, fairly easy to reach from the UK, and initially a lot of UK interests were up that end of things. Prior to 1750, there had been a number of different stations for Royal Navy ships in the Caribbean, but around about 1750, you see a big shift over to Bermuda, and Bermuda remains pretty much the linchpin of Royal Navy activity down in the Caribbean. Now, as for the squadrons and fleets that were based out of there, it varied massively. Those were the main bases. They might base themselves in other local areas at specific times if it was suitable for a campaign, or if they'd just captured an area, or if it was a good staging post. But exactly what forces were assigned to the various stations, or eventually the one station, essentially depended on, was the Royal Navy at war? And if it was at war, who was it at war with? So, for example, during the War of 1812, although Royal Navy strength would see a general increase across the board in the Western Atlantic, the primary base for Royal Navy warships concerned with dealing with the US Navy was Halifax. There was still a strong force at Bermuda, but Halifax was closer to the main concentrations of US ports in the northern part of the US East Coast. Whereas during the American War of Independence, when Britain was also fighting Spain and France, who were very eager to take various colonies in the Caribbean, while there was a British presence in Halifax, the majority of the Royal Navy strength generally tended to be in the Caribbean to protect all those precious sugar plantations and so forth. But the number of ships available, again, waxed and waned, and they shuttled back and forth between Bermuda and Halifax depending on where they were needed and basically which port had the better or available repair facilities. If the gods had wanted us to be happy, they would have given us a honey-based alcoholic beverage. Oluk Mead asks, what is an alpha strike, and are there any other named strikes? So my usage and understanding of the term alpha strike comes about from essentially colloquial usage that I came across when I was a teenager in southern London, playing various war games and so forth. Now, I subsequently am given to understand that the term, at least in terms of active warfare, was coined by the US Navy in Vietnam, referring to basically a full deck load strike by aircraft carrier aircraft. But in the way that I use it and the way that the people around me at the time were using it, and therefore the way I tend to use it on this channel, it refers simply to your first opening attack. And since you want, generally speaking, your first attack to be as powerful as possible and as overwhelming as possible, to do as much damage as possible, ideally so that you hit the enemy, they get hurt, and they aren't really in a fit state to hit you back. The general thing, apart from it being the first thing, is that an alpha strike is, as I said, supposed to represent a sudden big hit. So you're putting everything into it. So, for example, a ship of the line, like HMS Victory, breaking the line at Trafalgar with double or triple shotted guns, firing a full broadside into Bucentaur, is something I would describe as an alpha strike. It's a big, overwhelming punch, the first blow that Victory lands. And since it's a colloquial term, at least in my usage, I don't think there are any other named strikes. If the US Navy's invented other terms for their aircraft in the Cold War period, maybe someone can say below. But that's how, as I say, I tend to use it. And of course, the thing is, you've got to remember, in naval warfare terms, you might not necessarily want to use an alpha strike, i.e. a big initial hit, because you might have other objectives that are best served by spreading out your attacks. So, for example, in Operation Hailstone, the initial assault by US Navy aircraft is not a classic alpha strike. It's not the US carriers flinging everything they've got, especially bombers, at Truk. It's actually initially a big fighter sweep designed to suppress enemy airfields and stop enemy aircraft either getting into the sky or shooting them down very quickly afterwards, because that's then followed up by a fairly large strike by bombers and other strike aircraft, which of course would be vulnerable to the Japanese fighters if the fighters had managed to get airborne in any significant numbers. But since it's coming in second and third and fourth and fifth as the waves keep coming, that is not, strictly speaking, an alpha strike, whereas something like the first wave attacking Pearl Harbor could be described as an alpha strike in context of the attack itself, or the entire attack could be described as such in the context of the war. Lord Quack, King of the Ducks, asks, I know there were plans for battleships with auto-loading main guns that obviously never came to fruition. Given the issues that the 6-inch guns of the Worcester had, and the weight and complexity of the 8-inch guns on the Des Moines, would it have been possible to have an auto-loading main gun if, for some reason, there had been more than one generation of battleships in the late 1940s? Full auto-loaders, I don't think. I mean, even Salem's guns, this is one of Salem's triple 8-inch turrets, even those are, very technically speaking, not quite full auto, in that there's still a human element moving shells and charges into the ammunition hoists, even if the procedure after that is automated. And so when you look at perhaps the most famous example of a proposal for semi-automated main battleship guns, that being one of the many Lion variants in the last part of the 1940s, that word semi-auto-loading is critical, because in a full auto-loading system, if we kind of ignore where the shells are coming from with human power, the shells and the charges are brought up automatically, which, okay, they're fair enough, that's already done in battleship guns. Then the shells are automatically loaded rather than being under human control. That element, I think, would be very possible to automate, because it's a set series of actions. Shell comes out of hoist, shell is maneuvered onto tray, shell is rammed into gun. That part, not too much of a problem. Shells are fairly durable things. The larger problem comes when you're talking about the ammunition in terms of the charges, because on a 6-inch gun, or indeed on Salem's guns, the 8 inches, you can use brass cartridges, which again can withstand the rough and ready nature of autoloaders, and indeed 5-inch autoloaders, same thing. But when you get up to battleship grade guns, when you're talking about multiple charges in silk bags, even if you're using the sliding breech block principle, which Salem's guns also do, so i.e. you're doing a Krupp style arrangement, the problem there is that still only the last charge is a brass cartridge. The rest are still bagged. And for 1940s automation technology, I'm not sure bagged charges with their slight bit of flex and so forth would necessarily survive a strictly regimented, mechanically automated process, because all it would take would be for one slight bit of distortion, one tiny snag, and the rammer's not going to care about that. It doesn't know better, and then suddenly there's powder everywhere and things go very badly wrong. So I think this is why, when you're looking at the ideas that are floating around in the mid to late 40s, you're looking at the semi-automated systems whereby pretty much everything is being done automatically, but there'd still be a human check element involved in making sure that the charges are all aligned and ready to go. Now, of course, if you do go for full automation, you could potentially go for some kind of encapsulated full charge. You wouldn't want to do a fully brass encapsulated charge, because getting rid of that brass cartridge would be an absolute pain, but you potentially could go for something like, say, all of the charges being loaded in some kind of disposable or semi-disposable tube, or maybe being loaded in 2 sets in a tube, and that tube then being rolled out from the hoist onto the tray, and then a rammer going inside that to feed the bags into the gun, and then there having to be an automated process to remove this tube liner from the tray to make way either for the next one or for the last charge or whatever. That would be possible. And given that, yes, there were issues with the Worcester's guns, but the Des Moines class's guns actually worked pretty well, I think some kind of battleship autoloading or semi-autoloading system would have been possible, but either it would have required the turrets to grow quite significantly in terms of weight and size for a given ship, or downgrade. So if you were going with triple turrets, you might have to go down to twins to get an autoloader, or quads down to triples or something like that. Rebel Skverl asks, Armies predated navies, so it would make sense that navies would try to adopt army tactics and maneuvers to the high seas environment. What examples of these can be pointed out, and did armies consider adapting any tactics and maneuvers originally developed by navies for their own use? So, dealing with the second part first, armies generally didn't adopt tactics and maneuvers developed by navies for their own use, mostly because prior to the advent of heavily armed cannon-equipped ships, a fight at sea, as I've said before, was basically a fight like a fight on land, only there was a significantly greater risk of drowning or being set on fire. So there wasn't really a huge amount for land forces to learn from that. And then once you do move into the era of gunnery, well, a single large ship of the line might be carrying more guns than both sides in a major field battle would have access to, and they'd probably be heavier guns as well. So the lessons weren't really applicable. Towards the end of the time period the channel covers, things like rangefinders and fire control devices have a little bit of cross-pollination from naval service back into the army, but not a huge amount, because the need for army artillery tends to be, one, they need to be a lot more portable, so carting around massive rangefinders and fire control computers like you could do on a battleship wasn't really a thing that they could do, although smaller rangefinders were used. And secondly, again, portability. There's relatively few calls, again, in the time period the channel covers, for land-based guns to be firing at land-based targets over ranges of 10, 12, 15, 20 miles. Occasionally there are with things like big siege guns, and there you do get a lot more cross-pollination, but that's an exception rather than the rule. However, in terms of navies adapting army tactics and maneuvers to a high seas environment, there's actually some very, very obvious ones when you stop to think about it. The entire organization of ships in the Age of Sail when it comes to fleets is textbook taken out of medieval land-based warfare. So in medieval warfare, you would have a vanguard, a center, and a rearguard, and these would sometimes confusingly be called battles. So, for example, at, let's say, the Battle of Crécy in one of the many Anglo-French wars, you have the 3 English battles showing up for the Battle of Crécy, and the vanguard obviously marches at the front, the rearguard unsurprisingly guards the rear, and the middle force is where, in this case, the king is. And they would march onto the field, and then they would form up, and the vanguard and the rearguard would then become the wings, and the centre would remain at the centre. In naval terms, they adopted this, so you would have a vanguard of ships, a rearguard of ships, and a central force of ships. And this is actually where you end up with the terms rear admiral, who obviously would be in charge of the rearguard, a vice admiral who would be in charge of the vanguard, and a full admiral who'd be in charge of the whole fleet and the centre force. But of course, once you get beyond that, one of the fundamental issues with cross-pollination of tactics is that once you have your battle line sorted, a battle line of ships absolutely has to move, whereas a 16th, 17th, 18th century battle line of men, cavalry and artillery, generally speaking, once it's set up, doesn't move that much. Yes, they might attack the enemy, and there may be occasional attempts to flank, but broadly speaking, an army tends to position itself and go, right, either I am defending this patch of ground, or the other guy is defending their patch of ground and I'm going to attack it. So while there is localized maneuver, the whole thing is, relatively speaking, static around a fixed point, whereas for a naval battle, both the approach to it and once it's engaged, most of the time, ships don't tend to stay in one place. They tend to move with the wind and with the movements of each other. There can, of course, be exceptions, like the Battle of the Nile, where one side is anchored and the other side decides, well, that seems like a good idea, so we can have a continuous exchange of fire, or Nelson's attack on Copenhagen. But again, these are exceptions rather than the rule. Matt Blom asks, on a PBS Iowa YouTube video recently, former crewman of USS Iowa David Canfield mentions that the steam on USS Iowa got so hot that it no longer had any moisture in it, and furthermore, a drop of water could destroy the turbine. I find that mind-blowing. From an engineering perspective, how could a single drop of water potentially make a turbine shatter like glass? Well, before I answer the rest of the question, quick shout out actually to Dave Canfield, who is probably one of the nicest people I've ever met as part of the staff or docents or whatever of a museum ship. I, of course, unsurprising, met him at USS Iowa. I've met him a couple of other times subsequently at various HINSA conferences. But if you happen to be touring USS Iowa and you get to meet Dave, give him a handshake from me, for one thing, and two, count yourself very lucky because he's an absolutely superb human being. Now, with that said, I believe what he's talking about in this case is that once you've got this superheated steam going through the turbines, it's essentially near enough a uniform flow of heat and pressure in the form of, obviously, a very hot gas. If you ended up with a droplet of water in there, which of necessity therefore has not boiled into superheated steam, then if it contacts the turbine blades, as he mentions in that video, being incredibly hot, are then going to suffer a sudden and massive amount of thermal shock. In some ways you could even say it's reverse thermal shock, because in a localized area, one or possibly more of those turbine blades is suddenly going to be transferring an awful lot of its heat energy, because obviously heat tries to flow from the area where it's hot to the area where it's cold. It's part of how turbines work. But it's going to be transferring a huge amount of that heat energy in a localized part of itself to the droplet of water to vaporize said droplet of water. Now, this can have two very bad effects as far as the turbine blade is concerned. Firstly, as that droplet of water vaporizes, it's going to expand massively into a gas. So there's essentially going to be a very small localized steam explosion, which, being right next to, and in fact in contact with the turbine blade, is not going to do it any favors, considering that thing's already under a huge amount of stress, given that it's spinning really, really fast and, as I said, is already quite hot. And secondly, because metal expands when it is subjected to extremes of temperature, when it is cooled, it contracts, and if it's come in contact with a droplet of water, then you're going to get a sudden contraction, which could cause all sorts of interesting stresses on the metal, which, given, again, the general stress that's undergoing round and round and round and round at a very high speed, could also cause it to shatter, and the two effects combined, that's not going to be a good thing at all. And yes, you would, to a certain extent, get the Leidenfrost effect, but at these kinds of ranges, it's probably not going to help you all that much. So, for an example of at least the second effect that I'm talking about, now, I'm not saying go and do this, but some of you I know have done it already in the past, either deliberately or by accident. I know I have when I was a kid. But if you had a glass light bulb, an old filament type that gets really, really hot as it runs, if you then take a glass of cold water, and obviously you let the bulb run for a bit so it heats up, and then you pour some of that water onto the bulb, you have hot glass, which is being locally cooled. The bits of glass where the water has hit shrink, and there's a quick hiss of evaporating water, and then the bulb explodes. And of course, the reason I'm telling you not to do that is because it involves pouring water on something that is electrically powered, and to which you will have just exposed the element where the electricity is running to water, and there's a bunch of exploding hot glass everywhere, neither of which is good. So, unless you're doing it as a very controlled experiment, do not try that at home. But it gives you some idea of some of what might happen if you introduced a droplet of water into a running superheated turbine. Don't Look Down the Barrel of a Loaded Cannon asks, how efficient were classic Age of Sail vessels? As you probably know, any sailing vessel in pure displacement mode has a maximum possible speed determined solely by waterline length modified by hull form. No matter how much sail you add or how hard the wind blows, you're not going to go any faster than that speed. Yes, there are a few specific exceptions, such as in very, very, very shallow water, but has anyone analysed a classic Age of Sail vessel and compared the maximum theoretically possible with observed maximum speeds? I don't know if anyone has done that comparison. I mean, it should, in theory, be possible to do, but as you allude to, so you've got the standard 1.34 multiplied by square root of waterline length, which gives you a notional hull speed. This is as long as your hull is still displacing is behaving in a displacement manner rather than a semi-planing or planing hull, then you are not really going to exceed that speed, because essentially what that means is that if you hit that speed, you are perpetually climbing your own bow wave, which massively increases your energy costs to move any faster, because you're no longer moving horizontally. Well, you are still moving horizontally, but you are quite significantly trying to also move vertically. And, well, let's just say the energy requirements to move a several thousand or tens of thousands of tons in a vertical direction as compared to a horizontal direction when you're supported by and resting in water, well, that's a rather different kettle of fish. But then you have the hull form issue, because that 1.34, I mean, it's derived from a whole bunch of other mathematics, but it essentially is a reasonably good approximation for what you might call the average sailing craft. But warships of the Age of Sail are not your average sailing craft. They tend to be significantly bluffer around the bows because they're having to support these massive gun decks, but then the frigates will have slightly finer bows than the ships of the line, and so for a lot of these slightly more esoteric cases, you'll tend to apply some kind of modifier. Now, that can be a modifier to your overall result. It can be a modifier that just changes that 1.34 figure, etc., etc. And that to work out exactly which modifier you should be applying, you'd actually have to look at either each ship individually or find perhaps a general rule of thumb for, say, ships of the line and a general rule of thumb as a modifier for frigates. And if you wanted to be a little bit more exact, you might get a modifier for British design ships of the line versus British design frigates versus French design ships of the line versus Spanish design frigates, and so on and so forth. Because, for example, if you use purely 1.34 times square root of waterline, that would suggest that HMS Victory here has a hull speed, i.e. a speed it could theoretically reach, of around 20 knots, which is frankly ludicrous, and it's not that far off the maximum speed ever attained by a clipper ship, which had substantially better lines, a lot more sail area proportional to displacement, and was of course entirely designed for speed. So I think, yes, you could do such an analysis, but you'd have to work out what modifiers you were going to use for the various hull forms first, because of that unusually bluff nature of Age of Sail warships. Joao Rita asks, how many history books do you have? The short answer is I don't actually know. I tried to tabulate them at one point, but the last time I updated that tabulation was halfway through the pandemic, and I haven't really done anything with the tabulation since, but I've acquired substantially more books since then. Now, the way I did a rough estimate was I looked around in my office and I took 6 random shelves, counted the numbers of books on each of those shelves, took an average of that, and then multiplied that by the number of full shelves of books. That yields a figure of just over 2,000. Then you've got to factor in stacks of periodicals and other magazines that take up a lot less space, but are very, very important. You can see a bunch of those there on the right-hand shelf in this picture at the top. So once I factored in roughly how many of those I've got, plus books I own in digital format, whether ebooks or PDFs, etc., etc., plus the books that aren't actually in this office, that are in storage elsewhere in the house and so forth, or on loan to other people, and I've come up with an approximate figure of around about 3,000 to 3,500 naval history books or large periodicals or large booklets, if you add them all together. And that's being relatively conservative, so that might even be an underestimate. The Rogue Chief asks, in your videos, your description of peacetime naval appropriations, especially in the US and the UK, often sound like pulling teeth. But what about wartime appropriations? Do Congress or Parliament become a little more than just a rubber stamp for whatever their respective navies are asking for? Do they still ask for notional reductions that they can take back to the accountants, like, say, we're going to issue 1 less can of coffee or bag of tea per sailor or marine, or something in between? It depends on the conflict and the nation. In World War I, for example, a combination of both higher echelon naval decisions, but also Parliament and Treasury decisions, meant that while to a certain extent the Royal Navy could have almost but not quite whatever it wanted when it came to smaller ships, there was, for example, a blanket ban on building capital ships after the Revenge class had been completed. Renown and Repulse technically were reuses of existing contracts, albeit converted to battle cruisers, but that's why, for example, you get the large light cruisers of the Courageous class, which is a bit of an end run around the fact that the government has said you can't build anything bigger than a light cruiser. There is still a degree of financial oversight, but it tends to be mitigated in the most part by the fact that both parties want to get as many ships in the water as humanly possible, as quickly as possible, which generally means also not as cheaply as possible, but near enough as cheaply as possible, because, if you pay less for each individual ship, you can afford more of them. And your gold-plated solutions tend to take longer to build, which in wartime is not really a good thing. So if you look, for example, at the discussions around the design that would eventually become HMS Hood, the majority of discussions about what is her capability. Does she have the requisite draft or lack of it? Is she fast enough? What kind of armor protection does she have? Will she fit into various dry docks? And not how much is it going to cost. It's simply, this is what we need. This is how much it's going to cost. We've taken some sensible cost reduction measures, as I said, not gold plating everything. But, this is the final design. We need 4 of them. Give us the money. Now, obviously, there will be a little bit of pushback from the Treasury at times, but there's a limited amount that they can do. Where you tend to see more governmental oversight is when you're approaching the end of a conflict and you're now clearly making decisions on ships that will be built either after the conflict is over or will enter service after the conflict is over. So, for example, the Midway and Malta class carrier designs, although only the Midways were eventually built, were subject to a lot more financial scrutiny than, say, the construction of the Essexes or the 1942 Light Fleet Carrier Program, or to a certain extent even the Audacious class. But how much control the government and the Treasury has over the finances during wartime, to actually a certain extent can depend a lot on how sensibly the Treasury plays its cards. Because, for example, in World War I, the Treasury was fairly open with the floodgates, but demanded certain restrictions, and by playing off being generous on one hand and tight-fisted on the other, they were able to retain a certain level of control over expenditure. Whereas in the Second World War, the Treasury was prepared to give a lot less and wanted to exert far more control, with some possibly apocryphal, but given the Treasury, I wouldn't necessarily put it past them, accounts of Treasury officials in 1939 and 1940, for example, asking for reductions in armament on various bits of military gear like fighters and ships, because if you have fewer guns, that means when you shoot a bunch of ammunition, you won't shoot as much ammunition, and it'll therefore cost the Treasury less. But when they overplay their hand like that, that's when you tend to see Treasury officials shut out entirely of decision-making processes, and suddenly they've actually got far, far less control than they ever thought they were going to have. Greb asks, could you recommend a good English language book on both the Dutch Republic and Dutch East Indies Company, please? Well, if you want a one-stop go-to that will teach you almost everything you need to know about those subjects, then you want this one. The Dutch Republic, Its Rise, Greatness and Fall, 1477 to 1806, which obviously covers pretty much the entirety of the Dutch Republic as far as the Channel's concerned, and within that, the Dutch East India Company. It's by Jonathan Israel, and it retails in the UK for about 50 to 60 quid. So it's expensive for a book, but not as expensive as some. And, I mean, the thing's over 1,200 pages, so not only is it a really good book, it's also a really good counterweight if you happen to be building a medium-scale trebuchet. Can probably stop some small arms fire, and in a pinch, it probably will work fairly well as a home defense melee weapon as well. So, it's a multi-purpose book. Brian Smith asks, the Japanese Navy knows the US Navy is just going to keep getting bigger, so they decide to not wait and force a battle in the mid-Pacific, either near the Gilbert Islands or the Marshall Islands. What would the order of battle look like for both sides at either battle location, and do you think either side would change tactics from what we saw at the Battle of Philippine Sea? Well, it's not really good for the Japanese at all, because if they go after the US fleet while the US are going after the Gilbert Islands, so the invasions of Macon and Tarawa, they're going to be short 3 large carriers compared to what they took with them to Philippine Sea, because Hio will be just coming out of repairs but hasn't got her air group back by mid-November 43. Junyo, on the other hand, has just been torpedoed and is going in for repairs, and of course Taiho won't be commissioning until March of 1944. So, yeah, you've basically got Shikaku and Zuikaku and a bunch of smaller stuff, and that's it. Whereas for the Americans, they've still got, between the Essex's, Enterprise, and the various light carriers, they've still got 10 or so carriers. So that's not going to end well for the Japanese. If you go for the Marshall Islands invasion, well, you can get Hio back, at least, but you're still not going to have Taiho, and, well, I wouldn't necessarily rely on having Junyo around either. Meanwhile, the Americans have just got even more carriers. So, yeah, bearing in mind, of course, that it would be during the Marshall Islands campaign, particularly going after Eniwetok, that they'd lose the services of Intrepid. So, yeah, if the Japanese try and force a battle at those points, they're going to be short 2 to 3 large fleet carriers. And the other thing you've got to remember is that one of the problems at the Battle of the Philippine Sea was that the Japanese aircraft carrier pilots were still relatively inexperienced for the most part. There was a core of good veteran pilots, but for the largest part, after the battles at the end of 1942, the Japanese had spent most of 1943 simultaneously trying to rebuild their carrier air groups into something approaching the professionalism and skill of the original Kido Butai, but also confusingly taking half-trained or even just about fully trained carrier air groups and then distributing them across various island bases, at which point they would then get massacred by American aircraft. Whereas if you were going to be sensible about it, you would keep your carrier air wing and keep training it and keep training it and keep training it. And if you do need to ferry aircraft and pilots around, then do that with other aircraft and pilots, temporarily deck park or whatever. But that's the Imperial Japanese Navy for you. As far as tactics goes, well, if they've got fewer carriers and they're dumb enough to still try it, then I suspect they may have actually gone for what Spruance thought they were going to do at Philippine Sea, which is bait and switch. So use the carriers as bait, maybe just purely load them up with fighters, or mostly fighters with a few strike aircraft, and use, say, the Congos and maybe some of the big heavy cruisers to try and sneak around to attack the landings, because that's really the only thing they can hope to do is to draw Spruance out, because they can't, with that disadvantage in numbers, there's no way they're winning a straight-up engagement. I mean, they didn't at Philippine Sea either, but they're definitely not winning it now, at which point they're almost, not quite, but almost in a similar position to what Ozawa was at the Battle of Cape Engano and the Battle of Leyte Gulf as a whole. So try and draw the Americans away to allow other forces to hit the landings, but pretty much as you see at the Battle of Philippine Sea, Spruance is just going to sit there and go, no, I'm not leaving my main objective. Come and fight me if you like, or I'll come and get you later, but you're not having these landing craft. And yeah, so it will probably be very much like the Battle of the Philippine Sea, except on a very slightly smaller scale, because there may be 1 or 2 fewer American carriers and a lot fewer Japanese aircraft. Andrew Dedera asks, during the 19th century, was there ever a large Royal Navy force based out of India or Sri Lanka comparable to the Mediterranean fleet? It seems that most of the defence of the Indian Ocean was built on control of the entrances, the Cape, Suez, Singapore, possibly Perth. Would this be a result of a lack of nearby naval threats, a lack of targets, or possibly both? No, there really wasn't all that much Royal Navy presence in the Indian Ocean during the 19th century. Okay, fair enough. At the very beginning, when you're in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, there's a reasonable amount of Royal Navy activity there, but even that is significantly reduced from, say, the American War of Independence period and even the very start of the revolutionary period when, well, there were still French holdings in India, and therefore there was considerably more action going on there. But by the time you get into, the post-Napoleonic Wars, 19th century, as you said, the Royal Navy has locked down pretty much all the entrances into the Indian Ocean. And while you do have Italy, Germany, and various others claiming little bits and pieces here and there, which allow them to base a few cruisers there and a couple of destroyers and gunboats here, the Royal Navy doesn't see any major threat in the Indian Ocean, and so their own East Indies station ends up being, a few destroyers and gunboats, a handful of cruisers, obviously for long distance patrol and commerce protection. And that's largely because in the sort of area defined by the Indian Ocean, there just aren't that many very large, heavily developed ports. And the largest and best developed are owned by the British, and so they can essentially keep the whole area quite easily under their control by obviously limiting access to large enemy forces from getting in there in the first place. And what enemy forces there are in there? Well, between the Australian west coast, Hong Kong, Singapore, Ceylon as a backup, now Sri Lanka, and various Indian ports, they can sustain probably more ships in the Indian Ocean than the other colonial powers can put together. And it's not a very large amount. The other big linchpin of defending the Indian Ocean, it was simply the China station. Now, at one point you did have the East Indies and China station, but split into its own things. The China station did have a very substantial fleet. In fact, it was the third largest fleet at points after the Mediterranean fleet and whatever iteration of the fleet that the Royal Navy kept at home was called, went through obviously various names. But the China station was a lot more active and a lot larger, and that was based on the fact that, well, over in the Western Pacific, the French have considerably more interests, the Dutch have considerably more interests, the Japanese exist, the Chinese for a while are trying to become a naval power, the Russians have their interests with their eastern territories, the Americans are occasionally showing up towards the end of the 19th century when, they're actually allowed to have a navy again by Congress, and so on and so forth. And of course, Britain has its own interests there. They fought a couple of opium wars, for instance. You've got Australia and New Zealand down there in the bottom left-hand corner, and various other British holdings, and eventually with Japan allies. And so the China station at one point even has around half a dozen battleships, obviously pre-dreadnought battleships, a variety of first and second rank ones, as well as large cruisers, smaller cruisers, and so on and so forth. But the thing is, if you have this relatively large fleet there at the nexus point where everybody is likely to kick off, and obviously you have the biggest and nastiest fleet there, then that means that hopefully most of the fighting will be in that vicinity. It therefore won't be in the Indian Ocean, which is mostly just a really nice area to trade in. And if it does, then stuff will move from the China station to the East Indies station, but doesn't need to stay there on a permanent basis. Christopher Villenfort asks, the Chieftain has repeatedly talked about 120mm being the largest caliber that can be sensibly handled by humans as a unity shell in tanks, and that larger calibers either need to be split to split the load into parts, or you need to apply mechanical loading. Can this also be applied to naval guns before the end of World War II, where around 120mm seems to be quite a popular caliber on destroyers? And if not, what are some of the cut-offs in caliber where it becomes harder to load manually for naval guns? Yep, Chieftain is absolutely correct in that, because it's not about what you can bench press or what you can lift once. It's about what you can lift and move around repeatedly at high speed, because you've got to bear in mind that whether you're a destroyer's main battery or a cruiser or battleship's secondary battery, you're going to have to be reloading these guns pretty darn quickly because you're expected to maintain a high rate of fire. And perhaps even unlike a tank, you're actually going to be doing it for longer because in a tank, at least, the ammunition is there and you have to pick it up, put it in the gun, and that's pretty much it. If you're unlucky, it might need to be passed up to you. On a destroyer or a larger vessel, that ammunition is going to hopefully be coming up hoists or coming out of ready-use lockers. It's then got to be transported potentially a dozen feet or so, or potentially considerably further, to the gun. The gun may be at some rather interesting angle of elevation, and unlike a tank turret, you're not going to be in alignment with the gun all the time because, well, the gun might be pointing 90 degrees to starboard, 90 degrees to port, 10 degrees elevation, 50 degrees elevation, or any combination thereof. So you're going to have to essentially chase the gun around, and then you've got to load it, aim it, fire it, and then again, whereas a tank, well, in most situations, if a tank is firing more than a dozen rounds, something has, in one long burst, something has gone horribly, horribly wrong. On a ship, if you fired a dozen rounds, it might be, well, welcome to the warm-up of the battle. Congratulations, you've fired for a couple of minutes. Well, there's another hour of the battle, so good luck with that. And, yeah, it can be quite energy intensive. About the only advantage you would have is that in most tanks, you are going to be sitting, so unless you're lucky enough to be able to brace your legs, you're going to not be able to use the full strength of your body, whereas at least on a ship, you are going to be able to use your entire body because you're going to be standing and probably have a fair degree of room to maneuver. The flip side, of course, being that the ship will also be pitching and rolling quite a fair bit. And in fact, I would almost say that perhaps on ships, the largest size for a unity round practically is actually maybe even a little bit less than that. Maybe you're looking around 100 millimeters. And I think that's largely a factor of, again, in a tank, you are relatively static and you have 20 or 30 rounds max during your entire engagement perimeter to fire off. Broadly speaking, at least as far as I understand, modern and to a certain extent World War II era tank munition carriage capacities. Whereas on a ship, as I mentioned earlier, you might be expected to fire off 30, 40, 50, 60 rounds in a single prolonged engagement, plus all the physical activity of charging around trying to get the things out of hoists and across areas and so on and so forth. So the amount of stamina and the amount of energy that you're going to need and be using is probably actually even higher. And you see this to a certain extent in those gun caliber sizes, because even once you start splitting the ammunition into shell and charge, which is still relatively fast to load as long as the charge can stay at one charge cartridge, you still see this limit of sort of 5 to 6 inches, or roughly up to about 150 mil, 152 millimeters coming in. And that's with split. When you're looking at 120 mil for unity rounds, i.e. something where the shell and the cartridge is all one thing, well, that's 4.7 inch. And the Royal Navy found that, yes, you could have a unity 4.7 inch shell. People could physically load it. But given that the 4.7 inch was very often used either in anti-aircraft engagements, where you need a lot of shells sent downrange very quickly for prolonged periods of time, or in destroyer barrages, it was actually a little bit too much for people to deal with on a long-term basis. And even the 4.5 inch or 114 millimeter, which is a slightly smaller round, as a unity round is still quite heavy. I mean, this picture we've had during this question, that, as you can see on the sack barrow, is a pair of 4.5 inch unity rounds. That's not a small thing to be lifting around for a very long time, repeatedly. I mean, there's also aspects of, the weight and profile of naval shells and the amount of charge they have for the distance they need to go compared to tank rounds, but that's a separate matter. But as I understand it, a modern, let's say, NATO 120mm round, as a complete round, so, the penetrator on top plus the cartridge case and the propellant, is 18 to 20 kilos. The 4.5 inch shell you can see here being carted around with its cartridge attached is about twice that weight. And hence why in naval terms, 100 to 105 millimeter guns, i.e. around about 4-inch guns, tend to be the really rapid fire unity rounds you tend to see, because they're going to be somewhat lighter than, almost 40 kilos. And even when you get up to 114, 120, or 127 mil, that's when you're seeing really people preferring 2-part rounds. Jellicoe Cats asks, I was reading through a list of Allied hydrostatic fuses, as one does, and noticed an entry on fuses intended for depth charges launched from torpedo tubes. I'd never heard of one of these before, but the day after I was watching one of your videos where you mentioned them, so I guess it's kismet, that I ask which countries used them, what were they generally like, and how successful were they? For the time period the channel covers, they were only really used by the British. The Americans did look into it, but ultimately, obviously with their main objective being the Pacific, Japanese submarines just weren't as much of a threat and didn't tend to go as deep, so they weren't really needed. Whereas for the British, they were faced with the German subs, which were both capable of diving to surprising depths to start with and were progressively, for the most part, getting deeper and deeper. And of course, along with depth comes strength of hull, in terms of, if they're halfway down to their test depth, they'll withstand a depth charging considerably better than a sub that can perhaps only go down to 200 or 300 feet. And of course, a submarine that's, say, down at 800 to 1,000 feet, that depth charge is going to take a lot longer to get there, which gives the sub actually a reasonable amount of time to try and get out of the way. And so the British invented the Mark 10 depth charge, which essentially, as you mentioned, was stored in an old torpedo launcher, mostly because, unlike most depth charges, which could be either manhandled around by a few people or rolled around on a deck or moved around with the help of a small king post crane, these things, the Mark 10s and 10 star and 10 star star, weighed about as much as battleship shells and carried considerably more explosive because they didn't need to penetrate armor. So, we're talking about 1,500 pounds plus of weight, most of which is explosive. It's essentially a giant block of explosive in a wrapper with a hydrostatic pistol attached. And the idea of these was, one, because they were considerably larger, they could be built a little bit stronger, therefore they could survive going down deeper. Two, because they were so much bigger and heavier and shaped, because obviously it's not just mass, it's also shape, they would sink faster, giving the subs less time to evade. And then by having really, 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 really big warheads, it didn't matter too much if you were 50, 100 feet off target, because you were essentially erasing a very large cubic volume of the deeper part of the ocean. So all sounds perfectly good, except for the fact, of course, being so big and so heavy, you can't carry that many of them, and there's no way you're launching them off of a K-gun or Y-gun or rolling them down a rail, hence stuff them into a torpedo launcher, because a torpedo launcher is designed to catapult something of about that size and weight, or heavier, over the side of the ship. The flip side of that was that, although if they actually worked, they could be spectacularly effective, it was getting them to work in the first place, because they would just tend to sit in a torpedo tube, and particularly an old torpedo tube, for extremely long periods of time, exposed to who knew what elements, obviously not that easy to get at when they're inside a torpedo tube. And so when they were called into action, which required a British escort to both be fitted with and carrying them in an old set of torpedo tubes, and then to come across a particularly deep-diving German submarine, well, a lot of them had been in the tube so long they were a bit questionable about whether or not they were going to work. So, really good idea in principle. Occasionally, when they actually worked as intended, incredibly effective, but didn't actually work all that often, unfortunately. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, how would the Royal Navy have dealt with the Yamato if they had to confront the Japanese Navy after cleaning up Europe without US help? And waving away how that could have been possible. So I'm going to interpret that question, I think, as essentially what happens if Yamato does Operation Tengo, but the Royal Navy is the only force that's in the area to stop it for whatever reason, either because maybe Yamato takes a different route and the Royal Navy's British Pacific Fleet is in its path, or maybe the Americans are just like, you have a go at it. We don't really care. We're off to do something more interesting, or some variation thereof. But essentially, what you're looking at is what the Americans would call Task Group 57, what the British would call the British Pacific Fleet. And we actually have a fairly good idea of what that would have been, because just before Yamato sails, you have the first part of Operation Iceberg, and we know what the British fleet strength was for that. So you're looking at 5 fleet carriers, basically the entire Illustrious class plus Indefatigable. They, between them, have something in the order of around 80 Avengers, and considerably more fighters and fighter bombers to throw at things. There's a couple of King George V's and a bunch of destroyers and cruisers. And there are also a bunch of escort carriers, which tend to get left out of a lot of orders of battle. But the British did have a bunch of escort carriers there as well, which could, of course, loft their own aircraft, either for escort, cover, or strike. So the hilarious prospect of Yamato being set upon by a couple of swordfish is not entirely out of the question. Now, there are a couple of ways I think this could go. One is essentially that the British just do what the Americans did to Yamato, which is just mob it with aircraft. Now, of course, the British can't loft quite as many aircraft as the Americans did, but still 80 Avengers, that's a lot of ordnance, plus obviously all the fighters, Seafires and Fireflies and so forth, which can be equipped with bombs and a strafe to suppress Yamato's anti-aircraft fire. So if it was up to me, then the Avengers would be loaded out pretty much entirely with torpedoes, because let's face it, you'd lob 80 torpedoes at Yamato and more than a few are going to hit. And then worst comes to worst, you can go back and reload. Or even if the strike is such that you can do a one and done strike during the day, you hit Yamato with that many torpedoes and, strafe and bomb its various escorts, and the ship is going to be, at the most optimistic for the Japanese, crippled by the end of the day. And that lends itself to one of two scenarios. Either the British decide, well, the giant is crippled and at bay, so we're going to come in at night with 2 King George V's and a bunch of destroyers and proceed to torpedo and shell the thing out of existence by obviously using their advantage with radar. Or, alternatively, they might get over to some of the escort carriers and go, hey, yeah, you know those radar-equipped swordfish you've got? Yeah, guess what? We're borrowing them because most of the Royal Navy's crews are trained in night flights, and the Avengers, by that point, definitely will be reloaded. The swordfish have the ASV radar, and so off go the merry old biplanes to guide the rest of the strike aircraft. Obviously, you don't need the fighters at this point, into the crippled Yamato, where they can either then finish it off at night with even more torpedoes, or if by some miracle 2 sets of strikes by 80 torpedo-carrying Avengers, which again, may I stress, would be twice as many torpedo-carrying planes per strike as the Japanese sent in at Pearl Harbor. Then, at the next day, when Yamato absolutely, if she's not sunk by this point, will be very, very definitely crippled and out of action, then you can just sail up with the King George V and shell the ever-living daylights out of it, because if Yamato's been plossed by that many strafing runs and bomb hits, etc., etc., there is no way she's going to be able to meaningfully fight back, and it's kind of a repetition of Bismarck all over again. Glenn Ricafrente asks, you've said that the Japanese went in for turret farming in their ships because they anticipated fighting against superior numbers and wanted each ship to be able to fight multiple opponents. Did they make any other preparations to support this doctrine, such as installing special equipment like extra redundant range-finding and fire control equipment, having more than one main battery gunnery officer, or practicing this idea in various naval exercises, etc.? Well, one thing you've got to bear in mind is that when the Fusos and to a lesser extent the Issei's were built, the installation of what we would consider to be full fire control equipment, so rangefinders plus a fire control director, the electromechanical computer, etc., was all still very new. Yes, the technology had been invented and had been around for a while, but been invented and had been around for a while in the absolute leading navies, and bear in mind the Japanese had only just gotten around to starting to construct full modern capital ships in their own shipyards. They were still importing a lot of technology and getting used to its benefits and uses. And the Japanese are, okay, yes, they're at war, but relatively speaking, they're operating in near peacetime conditions during the 1910s. And with that said, even with the pressures of war, neither the Royal Navy nor the High Seas Fleet at the time of the Battle of Jutland had fully installed modern fire control equipment in all of their capital ships by the time of said battle. So take what I'm about to say with that in mind. The Fusos, and again to the lesser extent the Iseis, didn't have multiple redundant fire control stations simply because, well, initially they didn't even have fire control stations in the sense that we would understand them later on. They did, of course, have rangefinders on their masts and so forth. The main way that you can tell that they were definitely thinking about fighting in actions where the ship would engage multiple targets at once, apart from the fact that the Japanese explicitly said so in their design briefs, was where additional rangefinders were installed. So they had rangefinders up on the forward superstructure and foremast, as said, so they could do fire control from there with various calculations, and obviously as they brought in fire control computers, feed that data to there. But additionally, they had typically at least three, but usually 4 turrets equipped with their own rangefinders, and normally this would be the super firing turret fore and aft, and then either the super firing turret in the central pair, or sometimes, depending on the ship, both turrets amidships. So, the rangefinder in the forward super firing turret could direct the forward pair of turrets, the same with the aft pair, and then depending on whether you had 1 or 2 rangefinders on the middle pair, they could either act as their own 4-gun unit, or they could potentially supplement and split their fire to give 4 and aft guns to give a 6-gun salvo at 2 separate targets. As time went on, obviously, these rangefinders would be upgraded. Initially, they were smaller ones mounted on the turrets. This, as you can see, is an example of one of those 4 ships in the 1920s, when they've replaced them with somewhat larger rangefinders. So you can see the 2 super-firing turrets and the 2 amidships turrets there all have those ears, whereas the absolute fore and aft turrets do not. And they very definitely did practice this early on, but by the time you get into the interwar period and fleet sizes have been massively cut down, now the Japanese are thinking about reducing the American fleet to a proportion where they can fight them roughly one-on-one, and the shift goes over to, hey, we've got lots of turrets, let's point them all at the same target. Peter Guy asks, do you know who owned the various Liberty and Victory ships, T2 tankers, etc., produced by US dockyards during World War II? I know that before the war, merchant ships charged with conveying supplies across the Atlantic to the Allied powers were privately owned, but the sheer amount of new vessels commissioned during the war would likely have exceeded the post-war demand to transport goods, and thus I'm wondering if the US government would have taken ownership of the vessels rather than leaving them with private owners who probably would have had no use for them after shipping demand returned to normal levels. Initially, the earliest Liberty and Victory ships, etc., were built for replacement of lost vessels, partially as a result of demand from the companies who had lost said vessels. So a few did pass into private ownership directly. However, the vast majority of Liberty, Victory ships, T2 tankers, etc., that were built during the war, obviously, one, as you said, vastly outstripped demand, and 2, were being produced at such a rate that even if commercial companies wanted to buy them, they probably didn't have the funding. And so what tended to happen is that almost all of them were operated by various governments, particularly obviously the US government operating the most of them. And usually these would then be almost, if you like, sublet out to various commercial shipping interests. So a commercial shipping interest might be told, right, we are providing a Liberty ship. You will crew this ship, but it's our ship. We determine when and where it sails and what cargo it carries. So essentially using the private company as a source of crewing and that was really about all. And then, of course, at the end of World War II, that meant that because the various governments owned these vessels, they could then sell them off. So large numbers of the vessels were then sold off to private interests where they passed into full private ownership. And a bunch of others were just taken and stuck in mothballs. So sometimes you can see photos of US reserve fleets in the 40s and 50s, and you'll notice dozens and dozens and dozens of Liberty ships or Victory ships, depending on which photo you're looking at. And that's because they were owned by the US government, and the US government either couldn't or wouldn't find buyers for them, or wanted to keep them for strategic purposes for, transporting supplies in time of war, etc., and just mothballed them alongside, full-on warships. Robert Henry Ilston asks, between 1850 and 1950, what naval inventions were written off as failures, but as technology developed, were revisited 10, 20 or 30 years later, and then found to be quite successful? Oh, there's a whole range of them. Aircraft, for one. So they weren't neglected and seen completely as useless, but certainly the likes of Billy Mitchell and so forth in the early 1920s saying that aircraft proclaimed an end to surface warships, they were completely wrong. And analysis, which I'm going to do a very extensive analysis of Mitchell's tests at some point, perhaps later this year, perhaps early next, it kind of shows that, yeah, for all they were hyped up to be, unless you caught a fleet at anchor and defenceless in port, aircraft really were not a threat to full fleets at sea in the 20s and, to be honest, even the early to mid-30s. It's only really as you get to the end of the 1930s and aircraft capabilities in terms of speed, range and payload start to dramatically increase that the threat that everyone thought aircraft possessed actually manifests just in time for the Second World War. Another element would be guided missiles to go after enemy ships. Now, of course, you have things like the HS-293 in the guided missile department, as you can see here, the Fritz X in the guided bomb department, but because of the need for these to be guided in by a mother aircraft, which had to be quite large, relatively, therefore, unmaneuverable and therefore quite vulnerable, and then the rapid prevalence of jamming and combat air patrols and high-performance fighters and so forth, again, like the aircraft, while the idea of the guided missile never really went away, if you look at the very tail end of the period the Channel covers, and then going into the 50s, while an element of guided weapons technology is still present, it's very much in abeyance in favour of nuclear weapons, more advanced guns, and more general long-range missiles like what we would today term cruise missiles and so forth. And it's not till well into the Cold War that you start to get the first properly successful surface-to-surface and, by dint of fact, therefore air-to-surface as well, guided anti-shipping missiles really coming back into vogue. Fleet submarines are another example. The K-class, well, probably the best thing you can say about them is they didn't kill everybody who went aboard them, but the idea of this, big, fast on-the-surface submarine that could keep up with the enemy battle line originates in World War I. Everybody tries it in World War I, and in the K-class's case just thereafter, and it's a complete and utter dismal failure. People work on it off and on, and eventually, in the mid to late 1930s, particularly with things like the Gatos and their immediate predecessors, they actually managed to get the thing vaguely working, just in time for battle fleet speeds to massively exceed the speed of the now technically successful fleet sub, which forces the fleet sub to go off and do other things like horribly murder Japanese merchant shipping. And even to a certain extent, iron ships, because the first wave of iron-built ships actually happens in the first half of the 19th century, and everyone's really excited that, the iron ship is going to be the new, better, stronger, larger, more durable ship of war. And then for various reasons, including some I've mentioned in previous dry docks with things like the phase shift of metal, rendering the metal very brittle, the iron that is very brittle once it's in the water and so forth, everyone goes, no, this was a terrible idea. And what was supposed to be the first generation of iron warships gets turned into the first generation of iron store ships and supply ships and troop ships, one of which is the Birkenhead, incidentally, which is where you get the Birkenhead drill and so forth. And then fast forward a couple of decades down the line, and now iron-hulled warships are a thing, but only because they've decided now that they're going to cover them in inches upon inches of iron armour. And if you want a really long-distance one, you could actually say even the all-or-nothing armour scheme, because contrary to popular belief, the all-or-nothing armour scheme doesn't originate with USS Nevada. USS Nevada originates the all-or-nothing armour scheme for the 20th century, but the all-or-nothing armour scheme actually goes all the way back to the beginning of armoured ships as a continuous line of development with HMS Warrior, because HMS Warrior is even more an all-or-nothing ship than Nevada. It is literally a box of armour, 2 broadside strips and bulkheads, and that's it. There is no armour outside of that. So that is completely the all-or-nothing concept, except that then as time goes on, people start to develop this into the distributed armour scheme as more and more high explosive shells show up, etc., etc. They're trying to cover everything, and then it turns out that between high explosive and armour piercing shells, they can't put enough weight into the armour to cover everything against every kind of shell, and so you end up with a citadel, but the extreme ends of the ships are still vulnerable, so they're into high explosive, so they at least armor them against high explosive and smaller caliber armor piercing ammo. And that, as I said, gradually turns into the distributed armor scheme that we see in the late 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 1900s. And then basically half a century later, it pops back up again on Nevada, going, well, actually, we're going to concentrate everything back over the Citadel again. Matt Kidd asks, in the film Master and Commander, would lashing be the typical punishment for the level of insubordination displayed to Mr. Hollum by Nagle? Seems quite harsh for a captain like Aubrey. For the compound crime that Nagle displays, yes, unfortunately, that is absolutely a typical punishment. And to be honest, the fact that it's Captain Aubrey means, and the fact that he actually likes Nagle, means that Nagle actually survives. If he hadn't been Aubrey, if it had been some of the more harsher captains, the punishment probably would have been a lot more severe. So allow me to explain. What Nagle does is essentially 4, possibly 5 separate crimes in one as far as the law of the Royal Navy is concerned. Firstly, he's drunk on duty. This is actually a fairly serious offence. Secondly, he refuses to salute Mr. Hollum. Now, as anyone who's been in the military or any other position where you have to salute will tell you, saluting someone is not necessarily a mark of respect in any way, shape or form for the individual. You are saluting the rank. You may hate the person in question, but if they are a superior officer, as in a higher ranking one, you may have qualms about whether or not they're superior or not, you still salute them. That is always a hard and fast rule unless you have leave to do otherwise, and Hollum not being saluted by Nagle is a very deliberate slight. And that makes it not just an attack on Holland, but also an attack on the entire naval hierarchy. And that's a big problem, disrespecting the chain of command. Next, he shoulder barges Hollum. Again, that's a very deliberate action. You're technically assaulting a superior officer. You're going to get it for that as well. Compounding that, and this is where it's 4, possibly 5, is he does this in a very public place. This isn't the case of, maybe him nursing his sorrows with drink somewhere on the orlop deck and Hollum finding him and the guy just going, oh, you know what, I'm just drunk in a corner, I'm not going to bother saluting. That would be different. It would still be a problem, but it would be very different. Instead, Nagle does this in open view of everybody in front of the whole crew, which multiplies the insubordination factor, and depending on whether you split captain and crew into 2 separate categories, hence why 4 or possibly 5, he's also dumb enough to do this in front of the captain. Now, as I said, if Hollum had been, either down in the orlop deck or at his mess or whatever, and being drunk had just deliberately neglected to salute Hollum could have chosen to let that pass or not, and it would have been maybe water under a bridge. Captain hasn't seen anything. The wider crew hasn't really seen anything. His messmates, if they even saw it or realised the issue, might have just gone, oh, well, he's drunk, he didn't mean it, whatever. There's ways of justifying and getting around it. But playing it all like that in front of the crew and the captain is essentially Nagle saying, I feel that I can, even though he may not have necessarily realised it, but he is effectively saying, I feel I can completely disregard and disrespect the chain of command, and I don't care who sees what's going on. And in a small wooden vessel where pretty much the only thing that prevents anarchy from breaking out is a respect for the chain of command, that cannot be allowed to pass. That has to be punished to a fairly harsh degree. Hence the flogging. Now, the fact that Nagle was actually a pretty good sailor and Hollum was honestly a pretty useless officer means that there is obviously a fair degree of resentment, because ultimately whether he did this in public or whether he did this, as I said, quietly in a corner, doesn't really change the overall actual intention that Nagle had. And I think that's what the crew are really working off of. But it does change, if you like to use a modern term, the optics of what he did. And that's why you get the punishment. Al Sadius asks, I've been listening to old Drydocks, and back in Drydock 92, you mentioned around 2 hours 14 in, that one of your great uncles had World War II war records that were still partially confidential under the 90 to 100 year rule, that they might be accessible in 2 to 3 years if they were based on his date of birth. That was 4 years ago now. Has there been any luck in getting the records? And if yes, was there anything interesting that you'd be willing to share? Honestly, I've been so busy pestering the archives for other materials that I had actually completely forgotten to do that, because, well, my great uncle left me a lot of other material which I regularly go through as well. So, yeah, thanks for reminding me. I will probably at some point over the winter pull up the requisite forms and send them off to the various appropriate records officers and see if they'll let me have anything further. The only slight complication, of course, being that since my parents are still alive, I am not the next of kin, so I'll have to, if he was my father or he was my grandfather and my father was no longer with us, then being next of kin, I could just directly request it. But being a step or two removed from him in terms of familial relations by other living relatives, I do actually have to get direct next of kin permission to apply for the records, at least as far as I understand the forms. Daniel Silverthorne asks, having now transited through the Straits of Gibraltar during both the day and the night, has made me wonder if there were any ships in history, including the Age of Sail, but not including submarines, which have successfully made the transit through without being caught during open conflict. I know that SMS Gerben made it through during high tensions, and I'm sure other ships have managed that, but have any surface ships managed to evade their way through during actual conflict without disaster due to the extremely restricted waterway that the Straits present? In the First and Second World Wars, no, because Gibraltar's own coastal defence guns, and in World War II obviously with radar as well, plus the ships that were stationed there, made it pretty much impossible for anybody to sneak through. But of course there were patrol lines and all the other kind of stuff as well, especially in the First World War when they didn't have radar, so they had to rely on visual spotting, especially at night or in periods of bad weather. This is me actually taking off from Gibraltar, this was 2022, so you're going to get a view over the Straits of Gibraltar as we come to the end of that little clip, so you see what it's like. And yes, there's Africa there just over on the edge of the video, sneaking up out of the mist and the rock. Now, if you wind things further back, of course, Britain wasn't at war with any major European powers between the Crimean War, and the Russians didn't bother trying, and the First World War. So you have to kind of wind it back still further to the Age of Sail. Now, in the Age of Sail, yes, it was possible to transit the Straits of Gibraltar, although it was a little bit fraught, because, of course, if you could sail with a favourable wind and in enough strength that the Royal Navy either didn't see you because of fog or nightfall, or you just sailed with such a sheer number of ships that the forces based in Gibraltar, while they could defend Gibraltar itself, couldn't really do a lot to impede you, then you could do so, although obviously you did run the risk of being intercepted. So, for example, the Spanish fleet that Jervis and Nelson would meet at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent had just transited the Straits of Gibraltar. Villeneuve's squadron, when they started the run that would actually eventually lead up to the Battle of Trafalgar, which took place, as you can see from this map, not a million miles away from Gibraltar, they were started out in Toulon, and they went through the Straits of Gibraltar. Passing through the Straits of Gibraltar completely unspotted was somewhat more difficult, but you could pass through without courting utter disaster. It just meant it was fairly likely that someone would have seen that you were doing so and then reported it to the relevant authorities. Bjarki Hilmarsen asks, could you please include metric measurements when talking about lengths of various objects, and especially depths for ships and masts and so forth? Well, I can certainly try, and where nations built ships in metric, like, say, 20th century French and German vessels, then obviously I mention the metric and then also convert into imperial, because the vast majority of the stuff the channel covers is in imperial, and so therefore there's continuity. I can't necessarily promise that all the 5-minute guides are now suddenly going to have armour thicknesses and gun calibers and so forth all in both metric and imperial, especially because then you get into tons versus long tons and all sorts of shenanigans. I think for the most part that's just going to stay as is, mostly just for time factors. You've only got 5-ish minutes, and occupying an additional 30 to 40 seconds with just doubling up on the measurements seems like a little bit of a waste of time. However, in the longer form stuff on Wednesdays and Fridays and so forth, if I can remember to do so, I will try to double up on the measurements where appropriate. Silderan Machine Works asks, I've seen a film clip of a US vessel firing a 40mm Bofors gun at a shore position, and it got me thinking, were anti-aircraft guns, particularly dedicated guns on ships that didn't have dual-purpose secondaries, ever equipped or used to fire on surface targets? Would such ships have high explosive shells with contact fuses as well as the fire control systems to target other ships? Or was it considered that if an enemy ship came into range of, say, an Italian 90mm or German 105mm anti-aircraft gun, something, somewhere, had gone horribly wrong? Smaller caliber stuff like 20, 37, 40mm, etc. AA guns could and very often were turned on surface targets, because while later models would have, power operation and guidance from anti-aircraft control units, even those units had manual backups, and the early models were purely manual or largely manual. And so that meant that, well, if a target is close enough to shoot at and you're expected to potentially be able to hit it when it's a fast-moving small aircraft by eye, well, a relatively speaking slow-moving and considerably larger surface vessel, even if it's just a submarine, periscope or conning tower, should be able to also be hit by eye. And the use of anti-aircraft autocannon against submarines and at very close range, even ships, was very much attested to. For example, Laffey versus Hiei. But when you're talking about the heavier guns, like you mentioned, the 90mm, the 105, etc., that could be a little bit more difficult, because those guns were capable of engaging at considerably longer distances than autocannon were. But if you had a dedicated anti-ship secondary battery and a dedicated anti-aircraft secondary battery, like the Bismarcks and the Littorios, it was fairly likely that, at least early on, you might not actually have the fire control equipment aboard that would allow you to use those smaller anti-aircraft guns in an anti-shipping role. And then you'd be back at the problem that was facing everybody at the beginning of the 20th century of, well, my gun can theoretically reach out several miles, but laying the gun by eye on a moving ship, you ain't hitting anything at that distance. So, for example, as we recently covered with HMS Edinburgh, when she went after the German destroyers that were trying to and eventually did sink her, they actually ended up jury-rigging the high-angle fire control unit so that the 4-inch guns could engage surface targets by essentially fooling it into thinking that the German destroyers were particularly large and particularly slow aircraft. And this was historically a problem with a lot of anti-aircraft fire control equipment because the calculations themselves are not massively more complex, whether an aircraft is going fast or slow. But fundamentally, it costs a lot more money to make an anti-aircraft fire control unit that can start with assume target speed is 0 all the way up to 400 or 500 knots. It's much easier to make it just a bracket and go, well, we think maybe the target will start out at 100 knots, say, for a torpedo bomber, going particularly slow, and up from there. And some of them couldn't even necessarily handle that. Maybe they'd start at 150 or 200 knots. And also altitude also being a thing. Later on, you would get, anti-aircraft fire control equipment that was also perfectly capable of being used in an anti-surface role, but that's a separate matter. So when they're designed, at least, you can, in theory, use your 90mm or your 105s against surface targets, particularly against destroyers. But yeah, firstly, a combination of something's gone horribly wrong, because if something is close enough to need shooting with small caliber weapons, you should be using your actual dedicated anti-shipping battery for that. And secondly, anti-aircraft positions by their nature tended to be splinter-proof at best, which means if you're actually in a serious knockdown drag-out gunfight, even destroyer-grade firepower might well actually easily wipe out gun crews. So a lot of the time, if you had a split armament, the anti-aircraft gun crews, even for a German 105, would generally be taking shelter in the ship whilst a major battle was going on. Of course, there are exceptions to all of these kinds of rules, like, say, the Battle of Cape Matapan, for its exception at close range. But broadly speaking, yeah, you could do it, but certainly very early on it would be very difficult to. Later on, it was a bit easier to dual-purpose guns that weren't technically supposed to be. Nosdormu89 asks, so I noticed a trend, and I'm wondering how that came to be, and that is weight of firepower. It seems to be that less guns, but of larger caliber, is equal to more guns of lesser caliber, at least in the age of steam and steel. How did that evolve from the age of sail trend of more guns equals more firepower? Essentially armour. Armour is what happened, because when ships were made of wood, then as long as you were at a reasonably close range and you weren't running around with silly things like 9-pounders, then you could usually count on pretty much anything heavier than that going through. Now, of course, the bigger the gun that you used, the more damage in theory you could do, because let's say a 32-pounder, which was double-shotted with a cannonball and a bunch of grape shot, would punch through the sides of pretty much anything with a huge amount of energy, create a huge amount of splinters, and obviously a 32-pounder has a much bigger bore, so you can fit more grape shot in it than in, say, a 24 or an 18 or a 12. And so that would do a lot of damage. So ideally, you still wanted bigger guns, but if you couldn't have bigger guns, because obviously bigger guns weighed a lot more, then you could make do with just smaller guns higher up and smaller guns higher up still, and then you have the multi-deck tiers of guns that you find on first rates and second rates and so on and so forth. And then, of course, some bright spark in the States goes, well, hang on a minute, rather than having lots of long guns of different shot weights and therefore different calibers, why don't we just go, you know what, we're going to try and make sure that we're always fighting at extremely close range, and have a series of 32-pounders just of ever decreasing mass because we're making them shorter and shorter, and in the case of carronades, lighter and lighter. And as I said, it's basically, if you can punch through, reasonably speaking, almost any portion of the enemy ship, just firing an awful lot of rounds at them, especially in the absence of explosive rounds, makes more sense, because more rounds hitting means more things being hit that really don't react well to being hit, like people and enemy cannon and powder charges and masts and such like. But once armour comes into play, now all of a sudden you could have a ship that's completely covered in 32-pounders, and it won't matter the slightest bit if the enemy ship is covered in 4.5 inches of good iron, because you can fire 50 guns at them, you can fire 80 guns at them, and it'll just bounce. Whereas if the other ship has a dozen big 68-pounder shell-firing guns, you're in an awful lot of trouble very, very fast. So now, having bigger guns matters. And, well, what's one of the ways of measuring the total force of your small number of large guns? Well, multiply all the shot weight together, and that gives you a total broadside weight of fire. Now, you could, of course, go into all sorts of intricate details about armour piercing at different ranges and so on and so forth, and trust me, the people who are actually designing the warships did. But from a more public-facing perspective, and also from a general, look, this is the easy way to explain it, the idea of bigger gun, fire, big heavy shell, good. Big heavy shell is heavy, therefore will do lots of damage. And yes, new ship only has 8 guns, old ship has 10 guns, but new shell so big and heavy that 8 of new big shell actually is heavier than 10 of old small shell. Therefore, we have new ship with 8 big, even bigger guns. This good, please give money now, silly treasury man. This is kind of the level of reasoning that the Navy has to adopt at an outside view. So internally, for example, when they're looking at the transition between the Iron Dukes and the Queen Elizabeths, if you hadn't picked up of that was the particular one I was referring to, they're looking at it, okay, well, the 15-inch gun is capable of going further, being more accurate, and individual hits are going to hit harder because they carry more kinetic energy and more explosive. They should penetrate further. This is the theoretical armor scheme we expect the enemy ships to have. Therefore, the 15-inch gun will be able to do damage at greater ranges and at greater angles. So this is why we want it. And yes, because it's a bigger and heavier gun, we can only have fewer of them unless we want a really big ship. And believe it or not, there were actually 10-gun Queen Elizabeth designs, but slower ones being floated around at one point. And that's why, professionally, we adopt the 15-inch gun. Try explaining all that to someone who's more interested in why they should pay for it, or someone who just does not understand the physics of it, and you go, 10 13.5-inch shells, they weigh this much. 8 15-inch shells, they weigh this much. This latter figure is bigger, therefore these guns fire more shell at the enemy, therefore enemy dies faster. Okay? Good, thank you. We'll take the check now. 22NF2 asks, what were the biggest contributions of Malaya to both the Allies and Axis during World War II from a naval standpoint? And based on this, how important was Malaya in the Pacific theatre compared to, say, the Philippines, Formosa, or Hong Kong? Also, I don't think I heard my question from August answered. Having checked, I believe your question from August is actually sitting in the alternate history question set to be answered in a live stream when I can catch up on them. And yeah, I know I was supposed to do one at the beginning of September, and we're now in the end of October, but well, hopefully by the time you're hearing this, I've done at least one more Patreon Drydock live stream, and well, since now I won't be travelling over winter, we'll have time to catch up with a lot more of them, thank goodness. Now, outside of that, as far as World War II was concerned, Malaya was one of, if not the biggest sources for tin and rubber prior to World War II. Depending on exactly which economic sources you read, it was either number one producer of tin and second in the world for rubber, and some put those figures the other way around. I don't know why, I'm not an economic historian, but in any case, if you wanted tin, which is useful for a whole slew of things in military use, as an alloying material, as an element of solder for electronics and so forth, as helping to preserve things in, tinned food and all sorts of wonderful things. Tin, very, very important. Rubber, wheels, washers, all that kind of stuff. Yes, you can make it synthetically. Yes, there are other sources of tin, but Malaya had a fairly big developed industry for both. So, from a naval perspective, the loss of those resources, because obviously both rubber and tin are very important in various strategic components of shipping, especially warships, the ability to access those supplies early on was good for the Allies, and the loss of access to those supplies was a big negative for the Allies, because it meant that, for example, if you wanted a whole bunch of rubber washers to seal things up, and so forth, or rubber seals on your doors and hatchways, you either had to now compete for a dwindling supply of natural rubber from other sources, or you had to make it synthetically, which involved a whole load of extra effort and resources as compared to it literally grows in trees in Malaya. And obviously the flip side is that the Japanese now had access to all those resources, which they could then use in their naval aircraft and shipping. Although, ironically enough, having access to such massive amounts of natural resources, the Japanese weren't actually able to fully exploit the Malayan resources, in part because Malaya actually produced at points more than they literally needed. And once Japanese industry started ramping up and they now had a demand that would kind of match Malaya's output, it turned out these pesky things called Allied submarines had diminished the Japanese merchant fleet to the point that it didn't really matter if Malaya was producing infinite rubber and tin. The Japanese physically couldn't transport a huge amount of it back to their factories. SMS Schliessen asks, how would a sailor's family know if the sailor is alive or dead in the age of sail? When do notices get sent to families for the dead and missing? It could vary wildly depending on what the ship is doing, how the person has died, and where the ship is. So, for example, if you take Anson's voyage around the world, pretty much nobody knew what the fate of anyone on that voyage was for an extremely long time, years. And even then, it was a case of, well, we've lost a lot of people and a number of ships. We're not entirely sure who is still alive because, well, the dispatches that Anson initially sent didn't also include a full list of casualties. Conversely, if you're on, let's say, channel blockade duty, perhaps you're, patrolling up and down the French northern coast and somebody falls overboard and drowns, well, sending a message back home or the ship just popping back into Portsmouth or Plymouth or somewhere like that for resupply and getting notice out to the next of kin might be a fairly rapid process. Similarly, if a ship is engaged in a major battle, then the captain's reports, which will ultimately get sent up to the Admiralty, will usually include a list of casualties somewhere in there. The initial summary report might not, but a full report will follow relatively soon thereafter. Whereas perhaps if you're on a long-distance frigate cruise and you happen to catch some horrible disease and die mid-ocean, then you might not know until the ship returns to whichever port it is its home port. And then obviously when they're working out who are we paying, how many people are still on board compared to how many people does the initial muster roll have. Oh, right, well, we're missing a few. Yeah, we knew about that guy. Where did that guy go? I don't know. Didn't see him since we landed in Port Royal. All that kind of thing. And then you would find out. And for a lot of the Age of Sail, there wasn't a formal system of the Navy writing to each individual person and saying, well, unfortunately, your next of kin, your brother, husband, son, whatever, unfortunately didn't make it. A lot of it would be down to either being able to consult the publicly posted notices and captain's reports if they were published, again, depending on the time period, or local knowledge spreading. If you lived in the port that the ship was based in or nearby, then you could hear first or second hand that this unfortunate event had occurred, or the captain might choose to write to you. But it's not the kind of system that we'd have these days, where the Navy formally would keep detailed records of everybody and write individual letters, because apart from anything, up until the invention of the Postal Service, which significantly post-dates the majority of the classic Age of Sail, there wasn't any way to do that, even if they wanted to, at least in the form of a national reliable system. Fireteam Joker asks, the USS Turner DD 648 and USS Solar DE 221 were destroyed at anchor by separate internal explosions, both by anti-submarine warfare ammunition. Why was this ammunition so volatile? Well, there's a few different reasons why anti-submarine warfare munition, certainly in the Second World War, could be considerably more dangerous to a ship than, if you like, regular munitions. So, firstly, the type of explosive. Now, some of you might recall from the Spanish-American War and times around that period that TNT and other similar explosives were considered for use in naval ammunition, but they were considered far too sensitive, even though they were very powerful, and so you only see them in ships with weird ways of launching weapons, like USS Vesuvius with its pneumatic cannon. And so the explosives that go into regular shells, whether they be high explosive or high capacity or AP or semi-armor piercing or CPC or whatever, the majority of the explosive in those shells will be fairly stable and inert. Now, that's not to say that TNT isn't stable. I mean, part of the reason why it got a Nobel Prize is because it was considerably more stable than some other explosives that were being used at the time, but it is still considerably more sensitive than the typical ammunition explosive for guns, at least naval guns. Another factor is containment, because obviously an armor piercing or semi-armor piercing shell has to get through solid steel, and even high explosive or high capacity shells still have to survive the considerable forces involved in being accelerated out of a gun, and therefore the body walls of those shells are pretty strong, which means that to a certain degree, almost regardless of what's in them, they're very difficult to set off because, well, inert steel doesn't tend to explode, and subjecting it to heat and so forth, it's got fairly high thermal capacity, and the explosives inside, as we said, don't tend to be set off just because they've gotten a little bit warm. And so when you see ships that are destroyed by ammunition explosions, in almost all cases, conventionally, whether they be pre-dreadnoughts, dreadnoughts, Hood, etc., it's the propellant for the shells cooking off that actually destroys them. In fact, there are wrecks, including some of the Jutland wrecks, where ships have been seen to explode because their magazines have detonated, and yes, their charge propellant magazines have detonated, but there are still unexploded shells that were sitting directly above or below, depending on the time period, that magazine, which didn't explode and have just been thrown about left, right, and centre. Now, compare that to anti-submarine warfare ammunition of the period, Hedgehog projectiles and depth charges for the most part. Yes, they are launched, but they are not launched anywhere near as violently as a shell placed into a gun, and therefore the container that they're in doesn't have to be anywhere near as strong. They're not expected to pierce armour, so they don't need thick steel walls for that. And therefore there is a much, much higher proportion of the, as I've already mentioned, somewhat more sensitive explosive in a relatively thin and fragile container. Relatively speaking, I don't advise you go kicking a depth charge anytime soon. They're still pretty tough things, but in comparison to a shell, a depth charge is essentially a tin can full of explosive, which means that if there is an explosion nearby, it is far more likely that an anti-submarine munition will cook off sympathetically as compared to a regular shell. There are differences in fuses and the pressures needed to activate them, but that's not usually so much of a problem, although occasionally it could be. But the other big issue is the proportion of explosive. So if we take a Hedgehog projectile, for instance, a Hedgehog projectile weighs about 30 kilos, around 65 pounds. It contains somewhere between, roughly on average, about 15 kilos of explosive. So it's half explosive by weight. Now, compare that to, let's say, a super heavy armor-piercing shell for an American 16-inch 50. That thing weighs 2,700 pounds, or almost 1.25 tons, and it contains only about 3 kilos, or about 6 or 7 pounds more explosive than a hedgehog projectile. And your average depth charge will contain considerably more explosive than a high-capacity or high-explosive shell, which might outmass it by an order of magnitude. So there's an awful lot more explosive per ASW ammunition round. And then the final sort of pièce de résistance on all of this is that shells tend to be kept in magazines deep in the ship to keep them safe. By their very nature of where you need to use them, anti-submarine munitions tend to be kept either on deck in the open or very close to it. So you might have 100 depth charges on the back of a mid-Atlantic escort, plus, dozens of hedgehog projectiles both on the launcher and in the ready use locker immediately behind. And that alone might represent considerably more explosive than you might find in the magazines of quite a number of small to small medium-sized warships. And it's not in a magazine, it's just out there on the decks in, as we said, fragile containers containing large volumes of explosive per weight that are somewhat more sensitive than the explosives found in standard naval projectiles. Now, of course, this is all relative. Depth charges could and were knocked about by heavy seas, smacked onto the decks and sent rolling around with people chasing after them, Benny Hill style, and didn't go off. But in the rare, but occasional, like you cited, circumstances that something did go off in the vicinity of a whole pile of anti-submarine warfare ammunition, it's much, much, much more likely that you're going to get a catastrophic sympathetic detonation chain. Alec Hruby asks, if the Alaskas had been able to keep their original design speed before they got weighed down, do you think the US would have kept them around instead of the Iowas, since they would presumably have been cheaper to operate than the Iowas? I don't think they would, for basically the same reasons why they were decommissioned and scrapped in favour of the Iowas historically. It's not really to do with speed, it's to do with cost of operation. Now, yes, on a pure dollar amount, it would cost slightly less to run an Alaska than an Iowa, but not as much as you might think, because the crew complement of an Alaska is still incredibly high, especially when you're in an era where people are still using large numbers of medium anti-aircraft guns. Now, granted, if you get into the middle of the Cold War and you've pretty much stripped out all the 40 mils, etc., that's going to bring your crew complement down a considerable amount, but it's also going to bring the crew complement of an Iowa down a considerable amount. You look at the Iowa's crew complements, even with missile launchers and so forth, by the end of their service, and they've lost almost 1,000 people compared to their peak crew numbers at the end of the Second World War, when they had 20mm and 40mm carpeting pretty much every available area of deck space, and occasionally, when there wasn't enough deck space, the turrets as well. So you've got a fairly high crew cost, and then this is where things come in terms of military versus civilian. So if, for example, we were talking about ocean liners, and the Iowa class were somewhat larger ocean liners and the Alaskas were slightly smaller, then yes, a commercial company, assuming that they don't have the passenger demand, might say, well, actually, it's cheaper for us to run 4 smaller ocean liners than it is to run 4 larger ones. And therefore, as long as we're not filling the bigger ones to capacity every single time, we can get rid of those and just run the smaller ones. Now, incidentally, that is another factor. They only actually ever fully completed 2 of the Alaskas, whereas with the Iowas there were 4 of them. And there's the old terrible rule of threes, which is if you don't have at least 3 of something in terms of warships, you don't actually really have any of something in terms of continuous operational capability, because the general rule of thumb is if you have 1 ship in active commission, there'll be another ship either just coming out of commission or just coming back into commission from being in a refit. and the third ship will be in refit or repair. Obviously with 4 you've got a little bit more margin on that, but if you've only got 2, or possibly 3 if you completed Hawaii, you'd be operating on much thinner margins than with the Iowas. But that's a bit of a side issue compared to, in military terms, although objectively speaking it would cost slightly fewer dollars and slightly fewer men to run the Alaskas, even if you did build 4, it would be a huge opportunity cost in business terms, or you might call it a capability cost. Because yes, whilst the Alaskas are very powerful, their guns are not as powerful as the 16-inch guns on the Iowas. So, and you might think, well, that may not make a huge amount of difference, but you've got to bear in mind, in the late 40s and early 50s, there were big questions about, are the Russians actually going to build their own battleships or battle cruisers? And at that point, a gun that can outrange and overmatch, or at least match anything the Russians might put into service, because bear in mind, you don't know what they're doing. They might build some 80, 90,000 ton lunatic monster, as compared to the 12-inch guns, which at best, I mean, yeah, they're good, but they're still 12-inch guns. So if the Russians launch a genuine battleship or battlecruiser, at best you'll match their firepower. At worst, you might be outgunned. And the Iowas have considerably better protection than an Alaska. And that means that if the Russians build, let's say, a bunch of Stalingrads, an Iowa, within reason, can take on a number of Stalingrads and probably expect to come out the winner, assuming fire control systems, etc., are kept up to date. An Alaska might be able to beat one Stalingrad, but the minute they show up with 2, you have a problem. At which point, either the loss of the ship or the ship having to retreat and cede the field, that is a much, much bigger problem and a much larger cost, both in terms of your operational capability and potentially also monetarily, because, you know, let's say we're talking about the late 1950s and an Alaska is guarding an aircraft carrier, or an Iowa is guarding an aircraft carrier. The Russians show up with a pair of Stalingrads. If the Alaska is present, the Alaska is either sunk or driven off, and then the carrier is probably sunk or driven off. That's going to be infinitely more costly than any amount of operational savings you made by running the Alaskas instead of the Iowas in peacetime. Whereas 2 Stalingrads show up to fight an Iowa, there's a reasonable chance the Iowa, although damaged, will still be there at the end of the day, and the Stalingrads probably won't be, which means that your cost post-battle is not, we have to replace a capital ship and an aircraft carrier. Your cost post-battle is, we have to repair a battleship. And the Russians are down to battle cruisers. So that's a big part of it. And in fact, I would say in this particular case, the US Navy got the call right, whereas the Royal Navy got the call wrong. Because whilst the Royal Navy's call did, in the end, admittedly grant us HMS Belfast, in the 1950s, the Royal Navy, or more accurately, the higher-ups with a lot of influence from the Treasury, decided that instead of facing off against Soviet Sverdlov-class cruisers with HMS Vanguard, which could kill any arbitrary number of Sverdlovs, they decided it would be slightly cheaper to run a pair of town-class light cruisers, or derivatives thereof, and so Belfast and one other of the 6-inch cruisers was retained, despite the fact that, yes, in theory, a well-crewed HMS Belfast can probably beat a Sverdlov, but with the best will in the world, a well-crewed HMS Belfast is not going to beat two Sverdlovs, whereas, as we said, a Vanguard could take on any arbitrary number of Sverdlovs, and then it turned out that, well, they decided to keep 2 ships in service instead of 1, both to be in different locations and also to maybe actually have a certain degree of Sverdlov deterrent around for a little bit longer in terms of, one going into refit and repair. And it ended up that actually running 2 6-inch light cruisers, both in terms of overall manpower and monetary terms, was more expensive than running a single Vanguard, despite having significantly less actual Sverdlov deterrent value. So that, in my mind, was a terrible decision, whereas the US Navy, I think, got it right, and they're not going to change that just because the Alaskas are a little bit faster. Alex Moskovitz asks, Listening to the Admiral's playlist, there are a fair number of circumstances where a fleet admiral would ignore a command from a superior officer and do what they wanted instead. What factors would make an admiral disobey a direct order, and what determined how severely they were punished, if at all? Also, speaking of unruly admirals, I did make it to the Lord Nelson pub and it was excellent, so thank you for the recommendation. You're welcome, and yeah, it's definitely worth a visit. So in terms of an admiral ignoring a command from a superior officer, there are three broad categories in which they might do so outside of outright insubordination and they just hate the person in command and think they're an idiot. So firstly, it may be that the superior officer is seeing something from their perspective, but the admiral, or potentially captain earlier in their career, is much closer to the situation and can tell that those orders are not in fact correct, because limited perspective versus close-up perspective. So, if the person who's further away thinks, for example, that you are facing 30 enemy ships with your 15 and therefore is ordering you to withdraw, but you can see that actually what they've mistaken for 30 ships of the line is in fact 10 ships of the line and 20 frigates and brigs, well, that's very much in your favour, so you might choose to engage instead of retreat on the basis that, they're giving orders based on faulty info. And the reverse might also be true, where you might be ordered to engage something which is clearly based on faulty info and you're actually massively outgunned, so it might be in your interest to, move away. The second circumstance is similar, but there are some distinct differences, and that is where there are pre-existing orders that tell you to do something, but a new situation has arisen. So the orders that were issued were not necessarily issued on the basis of faulty information. The information may be completely correct, but thanks to the changing circumstances of the battlefield, there may be an opportunity to do considerably more damage to the enemy, and the opportunity to do so is within a certain window, which is perhaps closing quite quickly, and therefore it may be in your interests to break with instructions in the spirit of the orders. So the spirit of the orders generally will be destroy the enemy fleet, and then with specifics on how to. Now, if following those orders to the letter means that you will only destroy a portion of the enemy fleet, whereas a little bit of variation and you might destroy more of it, you can argue you're following the spirit, if not the letter. So Nelson at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, for example, comes to mind. And then there is a third, somewhat rarer instance, which is where a situation is not necessarily clear and could be going either way, and therefore the superior officer might give an order, but with the intention of essentially offering an option to the admiral or captain that they are sending that order to. So in that case, it might be deliberately phrased, deliberately worded, or perhaps there might be some pre-arrangement going on, or something contained within the message that essentially indicates to the officer that, yes, I'm technically giving you an order, however, I'm giving you the order on the basis of something, and if that thing is not in fact correct, then, while they're not giving outright permission to disobey the order, they are sort of giving tacit permission to disobey the order. So essentially it's up to your best judgment what you want to do, but here is an out if you need to take an out, because your previous instructions might, you feel, compel you to actually press the action when it might not be in your interests. So actually, Nelson again is a good example. At the Battle of Copenhagen, that being the first one in 1801, now, historically, Hyde Parker's signal to withdraw has been seen as, well, he didn't understand what was going on. So an example of the first option. But more recent analysis has suggested that perhaps because Hyde Parker had sent Nelson in to attack, he might have felt, well, Nelson seems to be having a bit of trouble here, so I'll give him a potential order to withdraw, but if he's not in as much trouble as I think he is, then of course, we can afford for him to not see the signal, and which is obviously historically what happened. So this is an example of an admiral not knowing something, but knowing that he doesn't know something, and therefore being careful to allow a bit more freedom of action. So it's a kind of a modification of the first circumstance, but with a bit more awareness. Now, those are just the broader ones where there's potentially good reason to disobey instructions. Of course, there are circumstances where there might not be a good reason to disobey an instruction. As I said, there may be just a very contrarian subordinate officer involved. They may actively be trying to sabotage the person higher up the chain of command, which does happen quite a bit in some engagements certainly in the early to mid part of the Age of Sail. Or you might have a variation on the first option where the captain or admiral, the subordinate officer, believes that the situation is different to what the superior officer is signaling them to do, but they are in fact mistaken. So, for example, being ordered to withdraw when you think, I have 20 sail of the line against the enemy 15, so clearly the admiral is silly, I should be able to destroy these fairly easily. But what you might not see is that the superior officer from a different vantage point can see there's another 15 sail of the line coming to reinforce the first 15, and you're about to be outnumbered 3-2. So there's that. But in terms of punishment, if any, it depends partly on the admiral in question. So who is the superior admiral who gave the orders? Some of them will be insistent on punishing someone who disobeyed orders in some way, shape or form, regardless of outcome. And others who are known to allow a lot more laxity within their chain of command and a lot more freedom of operation, like, for example, Nelson, once he gets to higher office, might only punish someone if it was clear that they were being absolutely contrarian or otherwise very deleterious to the service. And that brings in the second factor, which is success. So it's very rare that someone who disobeys orders and as a result enjoys massive unadulterated success would be punished. Conversely, if you disobeyed orders and something utterly disastrous happened, like you lost your ship or the Navy lost the battle, then almost regardless of why you did so, you're probably going to be punished. And then you've got that kind of in-between stage of, well, you might have been individually successful, but perhaps it cost us a larger opportunity, in which case there'd be a lot of very fine balancing going on, bearing in mind all the factors we discussed earlier. Lord Druken asks, you've mentioned before that you consider the USS Galena to be one of, if not the worst ironclads of the American Civil War. Are there other designs that come out of that war that you would consider to be as bad, if not worse, than the Galena? No. I would maintain she is pretty much the worst ironclad of the American Civil War, but that is because of the particular reasons for why I think she's so bad. Now, if you want to look at it from a purely objective standpoint, are there other ironclad designs that are fundamentally worse vessels in terms of, say, seakeeping, firepower, ability to exercise that firepower, etc., etc.? Maybe usefulness to their navy in general, because after all, once she was de-armored, Galena did actually see some fairly useful service. Yes, so objectively, there are worse ironclad designs out there if you look at it from those kinds of perspectives. But the reason I think Galena takes the cake is because she is on the verge of almost being useful, but also catastrophically not. The thing with most of the ones that are objectively just terrible designs is that it's very quickly obvious that they are objectively terrible designs, and therefore they are only needed in certain use cases. And usually those terrible issues are things around their speed, their agility, or their overall firepower. Most of the armoured ships that come out of the American Civil War do at least get the "we are protected against most enemy incoming fire" bit correct. Whereas with the Galena, or however you want to pronounce the thing, her problem, in my view at least, is that she is deceptive. Because, at least for an 1860s or early 1860s ironclad, she's got a relatively decent turn of speed, a relatively decent armament, at least for American Civil War era ironclads, and she appears to have relatively decent armor, which then encourages you to send her into combat situations where you need that armor. And then it turns out her armor doesn't actually work, which means a lot of people die. That is my big problem. If Galena had actually had functioning armor, she would have made a pretty decent ironclad, at least a coastal one. And if she didn't have any armor, which is her eventual fate, she makes a fairly decent corvette. But unlike pretty much all of the other ironclads of the period, including the terrible ones, she disguises her terribleness, which then, as I said, makes you put her in a situation that she can't actually cope with. Ferrata Victrix asks, I recently visited Kristiansand in Norway, where they have a surviving 380mm Krupp cannon. According to our tour guide, the Norwegians, after the war, once held a race along the 20-metre length of the barrel, that being inside it, the winner taking slightly over 6 minutes to traverse the barrel. Were there ever reasons why sailors would be expected to climb into a gun barrel in day-to-day activity? And are there any equally or more unpleasant maintenance duties that a crewman on the World War I or World War II era warships might be expected to undertake? Fortunately, there are no direct naval duties that require you to climb into the barrel of a battleship cannon, or unfortunately, if that's your thing. Cleaning a battleship cannon was done essentially the same way that you would clean out an Age of Sail cannon, except that instead of being a sponge on the end of a stick, you had a significantly stiffer brush on the end of a chain or usually a rope to stop it scratching, but that would get fed through. You didn't actually have to climb through and feed it yourself. And similarly, if something got stuck in there, then again, you would use something to push the thing out. You wouldn't climb in there and start whacking the stuck shell with a hammer or anything like that. So anyone who's inside a battleship cannon barrel is doing it essentially because they want to be there. Now, in terms of crawling into small spaces and actually being ordered to do so, and this obviously being a fairly unpleasant thing to have to actually carry out, yeah, there are a few like that. Traversing, for example, some of the masts, the internal sections of masts, especially tripod masts, as time went on, could get very difficult for people because, in theory, when they're initially installed, most tripod masts did have a method of getting up and down internally because they are big steel tubes. But over time, they were also very useful cable runs, and so they could get clogged more and more and more with cabling, which meant if you did have a reason to go in there, like repairing the cabling or trying to escape from somewhere, it could be a very, very painful and confining experience. You know, see what happened on USS Marblehead when she was bombed, for example. There's also boiler cleaning duty, which is considerably worse with coal-fired than oil-fired boilers, but someone has to sometimes go in there and scrape out the various tubes. But to do that, you have to climb into the boiler, which is, of course, coated in ash and various other bits and pieces of gunk that come from burning a mixture of coal and oil in a boiler, because by World War I, most coal-fired ships also had a degree of oil spraying, especially the bigger ones. So, and then you're having to pull even more gunk out of the tubes. So, yeah, it was extremely messy, extremely confined, not very good for your health, and, well, if you were lucky, the boiler was cold when they asked you to do it. If you were unlucky, and you had to go in and fix something, like on HMS Rodney when she was trying to track down Bismarck, then it was a case of, well, we've cooled the boiler to a point where you won't immediately die because the air is too hot, it cooks your lungs, and we're going to play a high-pressure hose over you to try and make sure you don't cook, but good luck otherwise. Fechtler's Fictile Fettler, fourth finest Fechtler forged for foreign Fictile fettling forays, asks, did the battleship Duke of York ever happen to be at sea within the range of an active V2 missile battery? And if so, could you give some dates and locations? The answer to that appears to be no, because the V2 has a range of about 200 miles, which essentially means the question is, did Duke of York sail in the southern part of the North Sea, roughly speaking somewhere south of Newcastle, from September 1944 to early mid-1945? And the answer to that is no, because in September 44. She was part of the Home Fleet up at Scapa Flow. She then went to Liverpool for a refit, so that's the western side of the UK, so the Atlantic side, not the North Sea side. And once she was finished with her refit, she was then sent to the Eastern Fleet. Now, she does appear to have spent some time after her refit back up at Scapa, so there is theoretically a scenario where she could have sailed down the North Sea through the English Channel and off towards the Pacific instead of sailing west down the Atlantic side of the UK. But it appears from period photos in April 1945, when she was doing this, that she stopped at least once in Liverpool, which indicates she was sailing down the Atlantic side of things, which would make a bit more sense because, why shove Duke of York and Anson, two of your latest battleships, into range of numerous short-range German U-boats, E-boats, and what's left of the Luftwaffe, when you can just avoid that by going west. It's pretty much the same distance. So it would appear that in her operational service, no, she was never in range of an active V2 battery. Nick Brodar asks, had Kurita recognised Taffy 3 for what it was and just barreled straight through them instead of engaging, could he have wiped out 7th Fleet? It's actually a very interesting one, because on paper, yes, there is a possibility. When you look at the order of battle of 7th Fleet and the order of battle of Kurita's force, at least at the time of Samar, bearing in mind, obviously, you've lost Musashi and a whole load of heavy cruisers already, 7th Fleet has slightly more destroyers and slightly more cruisers, but the margin of destroyers is not, I would say, large enough to assure victory in that realm of things. Now, granted, the Allied destroyers absolutely will win a straight-up gunfight because they are superior gun vessels, but of course, the majority of the Japanese destroyers are heavily torpedo-based, so that's a risk, especially because you're not necessarily going to get an ideal matchup. The Japanese destroyers, for example, might go after the capital ships and cruisers. Again, cruiser-wise, there is a very, very, very slight margin of numerical superiority for the Allies in terms of cruisers, but the Japanese have more heavy cruisers, because apart from one light cruiser, the Japanese force is entirely heavy cruisers, whereas the Allied force has a mixture of light and heavy cruisers. Now, you can argue that Brooklyn class with 6-inch guns will still be fairly capable, and that is a fair point to argue. However, in absolute terms, the Japanese 8-inch cruisers outrange the 6-inch cruisers, and as we saw at Samar, they were willing to engage at long ranges. So, coupled with the fact that there's pretty much only really one ship in it, the cruiser forces, I would say, are, broadly speaking, equally matched, all other things being equal, with, of course, factors of, what are the destroyers doing to influence this fight. And then you have the battle lines. So Nagato is, probably, roughly speaking, at least in daylight, when her optical fire control systems can work well, pretty much probably the equal of any of the American ships that are there. Now, yes, you've got Colorado and West Virginia there, and yes, with radar-directed fire control, they arguably have a superior overall fire control suite to Nagato. However, as I said, this is assuming a daylight engagement, where Nagato's fairly good optical fire control system will make up a lot of that margin, and Nagato has a few minor advantages, primarily speed, to be perfectly honest. But that leaves 5 versus 3. Now, okay, 3 of the 3 Japanese ships, Kongo and Haruna, outside of being able to run away, are objectively going to struggle against most of the American standards because, well, one side has armor and the other side, practically speaking, doesn't. Also, there's more guns per ship on the American ships. So, they can occupy some American ships, but not for tremendous amounts of time, I suspect, before they get hit quite badly. And then you have the big elephant in the room, which is, of course, Yamato. Yamato would be going into an engagement, the specific kind of engagement she was designed to, i.e. fighting at against multiple smaller enemy capital ships, and her armour is pretty solid against pretty much anything they can throw against, so certainly at medium to medium long ranges. And so, although it's a fairly close match just of examining the two orders of battle, there is potential for the Japanese to pull off a win. They do have a mobility advantage. The Americans would be tied down, one, to defending the landing forces, and two, by the fact the standards are not particularly quick in and of themselves, which would allow, in theory, the Japanese to achieve a concentration of force against part of the American formation while the others struggle to catch up, which might then multiply the effect of the Congos, because, for example, if the Americans are forced to try and deal with a Japanese fleet that's trying to go around them, you could end up in a situation where only cruisers and destroyers might be in a position to block their advance, at which point the Congos, well, this is now their natural hunting environment. Conversely, they might be able to isolate a portion of 7th Fleet ships. Not that the 7th Fleet would probably allow its ships to get broken up, but again, if you're doing an end run around them, you might end up where the trailing 7th Fleet standard types are essentially masked by the leading ones and maybe slightly out of range if the Japanese choose to engage at long range, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, there's also the possibility they might just smash into each other and Yamato might demolish 2 or 3 ships in fairly short order. You never know. Plus, of course, as we said, the Japanese cruisers and destroyers have lots and lots of long lances, so there's a possibility of mass long lance attack taking out a number of the American battleships, possibly some of the cruisers as well. So there are circumstances in which, just in that matchup, Kurita could win. However, there are other circumstances where he might lose, just in a straight-up match, and the big factor hanging over all this is Taffy's 1 and 2, because there's a bunch of extra escorts there and aircraft, which can obviously initially drop some bombs and do some strafing runs and then rearm with torpedoes and so forth. So the Americans do have air support from the Taffies as an additional factor to play into all of this. So it's a kind of thing of, yes, in theory, he could have, this being Kurita, could have wiped out 7th Fleet, but it's relatively unlikely and would require a very specific set of circumstances, but not ones that are entirely implausible, and it might cost him his fleet to do so. Farenda Ritter asks, there's been much talk of the Royal Navy in the Victorian era being a place where officers were promoted due to whitewashing the Navy, as in they're good at paperwork and keeping a clean ship due to the lack of combat for so long. Was this actually the case, and are there any examples of such? And if so, how did the Royal Navy end up faring relatively well in World War I if the officers were not good fighters? It absolutely was the case, but it wasn't the case across the board of the entire Victorian Navy, because although, well, the Victorian Navy is strictly speaking from the reign of Queen Victoria, but obviously some people do also classify essentially the post-1815 Royal Navy, so let's say the 19th century Royal Navy, but going forward from that point, from 1815 through to pretty much the start of the Ironclad era, although there weren't major wars, the Royal Navy was involved in a series of smaller conflicts, whether that be clearing out some of the Barbary pirates, the bombardment of Algiers, various skirmishes, peacekeeping efforts, shooting up random countries in rebellion. I mean, there's a whole series of things that go on in the Eastern Mediterranean during that period. And then the Crimean War, which is a major operation on land, not so much at sea. There are a lot of forces deployed at sea, but there isn't any significant naval combat, mostly because the Russians run and hide and later sink their ships in the most part. And then in the 1860s, you've got an awful lot of technological innovation and war scares, which keeps everybody on their toes. The spit and polish era really only kicks in the mid to late 1870s as the threat from France goes into abeyance, partially because of the aftershocks of the Franco-Prussian War. And you can kind of see this as well reflected in the ships that the Royal Navy builds. These sort of one-offs trying to compete with very specific ships that everyone else is building rather than clear, coherent design choices and lineages. And this lasts for most of the rest of the 19th century, and you do see plenty of examples. You see captains cancelling gunfire practice because the smoke and the fumes will ruin the paintwork. You have some cases of bulkhead doors not able to close because they're under 16 to 20 layers of paint. But it's not universal across the fleet, even during this period. There are various admirals who fight against it, and it is a period that comes to an end. As you get to the end of the 1890s and start heading into the 1900s, you have the Spanish-American War, the Russo-Japanese War, the beginnings of the Anglo-German naval arms race. All of this is a bit of a wake-up call, and then you get admirals like Admiral Sir Percy Scott, obviously Fisher, and so forth, as well as some of the admirals who fostered them, and of course some of the officers that they themselves are fostering. They kind of start to clean things out a little bit. And then with skill in gunnery practice becoming more and more of a prestige item, and of course ships also, to be honest, shifting over to grey or white for either home or tropical service, the whole thing kind of dies away a bit of a death. So by the First World War, the Royal Navy is by and large a very professional force. There are still a few minor hangers-on in the Volunteer Reserve and maybe some of the upper echelons, but it's nowhere near as bad as it was in the, say, 1880s. Nathapron Hongsharon asks, given the fact that by the time the treaty was started, that being the Washington Naval Treaty negotiations, the G3s weren't even laid down while the Keys construction had already been started, is it really fair to compare the G3 with the Lexington and Amagi, or should they be compared with Key or perhaps even number 13? I think it is fair for a number of reasons. So, firstly, although we don't have photographic evidence, we do have documentary evidence that at least one G3 had its keel laid down because the Treasury was billed by one of the shipyards for work involved in doing so at the end of 1921. Now, granted, the Lexingtons were on average laid down just over a year earlier, the Amagis slightly less than that, but the second two of the Amagis are pretty much contemporaneous in terms of keel dates with the first of the G3s. And when you look at other ships from both before and after, the Queen Elizabeth are often compared to the Bayerns, despite the fact that the very first of the Bayerns wasn't laid down until about half a year after the bulk of the Queen Elizabeths had been laid down, Malaya being something of a late addition, and even she was laid down still before Bayern and Baden. And the King George V's and North Carolina are often compared, despite the fact that King George V is laid down well over a year before North Carolina. So I'd say with all three classes of battlecruiser having a keel-laying date for first of class within a year to a year and a half of each other, they're roughly contemporaneous. There's also the matter of design choices and styles. They are all three of them the first battle cruisers that those countries have laid down post-World War I. In the case of the Americans, the first battle cruisers they've laid down, period. And operational date-wise, well, in the World War I period, British shipyards, particularly the British Royal Dockyards, tend to complete their ships a little bit faster than a lot of other nations. And so even though they're a little bit slower in laying them down, I think it's relatively plausible to say that the G3s would have come into service at roughly the same time as the average Lexington or the Amagis would have done. And the Keys probably would have been in service a year or two later, which, given that obviously with the Keys being laid down and then the number 13s, the Americans and the British would have had to respond to those with further designs to which more direct comparison would be better made. Red Ranger asks, in preparation for the metallurgy section of my engineering course, I rewatched your videos on naval armour, and some thoughts occurred to me. First, was there any cross-pollination between the Army and Navy when it came to armour technology or production? And second, I noticed more than a few tanks used homogeneous armour rather than face-hardened. Was the thickness of the armour in the latter case just not enough to make it face-hardening worth it, a measure just to get more out the door quickly, or is there something else that I'm missing? There was a certain degree of cross-pollination because quite often the same companies were making armour for tanks and for battleships. So obviously if they make some kind of advancement in chemical formula or production method, then that's going to be shared across the board, whatever they're producing that happens to need armour. However, there is only a certain amount of cross-pollination that can occur in these circumstances due to the nature of the armour that's produced. As you mentioned, the vast majority of tank armour is homogeneous. There are some rare cases of vehicles, particularly German vehicles in the Second World War in the latter stages, having some kind of hardened face on their armour plates, but broadly speaking, face-hardened armour, even on warships, tends to be restricted to the heavier thicknesses of plate. And there are legitimate arguments to be made for the use of homogeneous rather than face-hardened armour in certain circumstances, especially in case of glancing blows. There's a whole turret roof discussion to be had in a video at some point about that. But obviously, the more and more tank armour tended towards sloping rather than just this sort of, Churchill-Cromwell style of slab-sidedness, then the more and more homogeneous armour tended to make sense. And you've also got to think about the threat profile, because compared to the serious armour used in warships, even the thickest tank armour, by and large, in World War II was pretty anemic. I mean, a Tiger tank, 100 to 120 millimeters armour, 4 to 4.7 inch? I mean, that's a small part of the Tiger's overall protection profile that maybe just about matches a half-decent heavy cruiser's armour belt, not necessarily even the turret on a number of armoured cruisers, and would be considered pathetic beyond extremes on battleships. But at the same time, again, outside of something like a Jag Tiger or an IS-2, the vast majority of shells being thrown around, even in a late World War II era tank battle, are 3 to 3.7 inch or 3.5 inch shells. So, your 75, 76, 88, maybe 90 mil if you're on the Italian front, that kind of thing. And armour-piercing shells in those calibers are pretty much unheard of on battleships because the guns are considered too small. You might start to see some armour-piercing shells at the 4.5 to 4.7 inch range, although even then they're more like semi-armour piercing. And it's really only once you get up to things like 5 and 6 inch guns that you'll start to see proper AP shells. Whereas, again, conversely, most of the time on a World War II tank battlefield, if someone's flinging a 5, 6 inch or thereabouts shell at you, it's probably a high explosive shell from a heavy artillery piece. So it's a slightly different combat environment, but ultimately, outside of some niche cases, the other thing is that the physical properties that make face-hardened armour so good against incoming shells tend to not work quite as well at very thin levels of plate. So if you are sporting 2, 3, 4 inches of armour on a late World War II era tank, it's only going to be at the absolute thickest points of the tank that realistically face hardening your armour is going to make any significant effect or difference against the rounds that are being fired at you. Whereas on a battleship, or even a fairly decently armoured cruiser, where you might have 5 or 6 inches of armour minimum, going up to obviously over a foot thick, then all of a sudden the face hardening makes a lot more sense from a physical standpoint. And yes, there are cost implications as well. So if you're only going to get, using arbitrary figures, say a 5% improvement in your armour for giving yourself, say, face-hardened 3-inch armour, and in exchange it's going to cost twice as much and take 3 times as long to produce that armour, well, you might as well just not do that and make 3 tanks and maybe use some of that saved money to just put a little bit more regular homogeneous armour on. The Freaker 86 asks, the Bureau of Ordnance is known for the near-criminal behaviour it took part in during the Mark 14 disaster, but are there any instances where in the 1930s till the end of World War II the Bureau of Ordnance did an outstanding job, and even things that were unexpectedly outstanding? Sure, there are plenty of things. The thing is, with the Bureau of Ordnance, you've got to bear in mind that it was broken down into a number of discrete sub-departments. So the torpedo department, yeah, they have a lot to answer for. Obviously the Mark 14, then there's the whole thing with the Mark 18. That's scarcely any better. But the gun department tended to do a pretty outstanding job. Bear in mind, it would have been the Bureau of Ordnance department that deals with the sub-department that dealt with guns that invented, tested, and distributed the 5-inch 38. They also, admittedly, after something of miscommunication with other bureaus, managed to get the 16-inch 50 Mark 7 out the door in record time. They also supervised the development of the super heavy shell, which, although I do have 1 or 2 issues with, broadly speaking, is a very, very capable munition. So I think essentially, at least as far as capital ships and surface-based warships are concerned, if you're dealing with the part of the Bureau of Ordnance that is to do with the invention of guns and their ammunition, they tend to do very, very well in their jobs, for the most part. They have a few screw-ups as well. Whereas if you're dealing with underwater munitions, like torpedoes, that's where you find religion very quickly, because you are going to need divine intervention if you want to survive the experience. There are other areas that the Bureau of Ordnance covers as well, but those are the main two that you're going to be concerned about as a sailor. John McDonough asks, during the American Revolution, the British spent a whole lot of time and effort early on in the war to occupy and defend Newport, Rhode Island. On the whole, however, they seem to have made fairly little effort to exploit its possession and then abandoned it to the French in 1779. Why is that? Narragansett Bay could easily have sheltered a huge fleet, provided easy, unbreakable access to the interior of New England and Boston, and Newport was eminently defensible, being an island. So was it just a lack of resources that turned it from an asset to a liability that then needed to be abandoned? Well, your opinion is actually shared by a number of British admirals at the time who were very, very unhappy with the idea of leaving Newport for precisely the reasons you mentioned. It's a nice sheltered harbour, very secure, relatively easy to defend, and as more than one of them pointed out, it also was within relatively short sailing distance of pretty much every major US port city as existed at that time. However, on a grander strategic level, it seems that the British had decided that, as in, British High Command, had decided that the northern colonies, i.e., Connecticut, Massachusetts, New England, etc., were broadly speaking extremely resistant to being pacified and seemed to have a very high revolutionary sentiment, whereas they thought that perhaps there were more loyalists down in the south, and also with the entry of France and Spain into the war, it meant that there was a considerably greater threat to their very valuable holdings in the Caribbean. And so there was a decision to try and switch the focus of the war more to the south, which would allow the British to defend their Caribbean colonies and continue the war in the southern part of what was then the 13 colonies. And that meant leaving Newport because, well, that's in the north, so, let's all head south. Of course, the position is slightly ironic, given that by the end of the War of 1812, the states that were most in favour of getting over it and getting back on track with having decent diplomatic relations with Britain would be those very same states that in the 1770s were incredibly difficult to convince to, turn their loyalties back to the crown. But that's neither here nor there. But fundamentally, the problem was that, holding Rhode Island and Newport in particular is the absolute perfect move if you want to fight what would eventually become the United States of America. However, by the time the British decided to abandon it, they had taken the view that they weren't so much fighting a rebellious set of colonies, it was more that, it's another round of war with France and Spain, and this whole thing with the colonies is just now a theatre of a much greater war, and therefore they started making decisions based on what's best to defend the empire as a whole, rather than what's best to confront the colonies in particular. John M. asks, in the book Jutland, the Naval Staff Appreciation, edited by William Schleihauf, pages 243 to 246 inclusive, the editor afterward writes that two brothers writing the Naval Staff Appreciation, Kenneth and Alfred Dewar, were openly hostile to Jellicoe and almost, if not actually, sycophantic to Beatty. That in itself should raise concerns. The afterward author wrote that the Dewars come exceedingly close to comparing Jellicoe to Byng. How could the Admiralty allow people so one-sided to write their official review and expect a neutral report? Well, the short answer is that it wasn't an official neutral report, in large part, because Jellicoe was, by the point it was written, not in the naval hierarchy anymore, having been removed as First Sea Lord a little while ago and about to take up a position as Governor-General of New Zealand. And guess who was in command of the Royal Navy, who was First Sea Lord? Well, of course, it was Admiral Beatty. And Admiral Beatty had every reason to make sure that any kind of official internal report be used to lump as much blame as possible on Jellicoe, and hence the selection of authors for the most part. And in some cases, the rather creative use or creative not inclusion of certain bits of evidence. There's a good reason why, after Beatty himself was out of office. Subsequent First Sea Lords tried their very best to recall and destroy it because it was far, far, far too partisan in its appreciation of who was responsible for what happened, whether it was Beatty or Jellicoe. And by the end of the 1920s, beginning of the 1930s, it was actually beginning to cause major issues internally within the Royal Navy, at least for the people who'd read it, because there weren't that many copies distributed. Now, that doesn't necessarily take away from some of the technical aspects of it. The technical analyses are still pretty good because, well, technical analysis can't really blame anyone for its contents. But the tactical elements and the command responsibility elements, you basically need a truckload of salt at that point. Leon Wu asks, why are only some German destroyers given a name rather than an alphanumeric designation? For example, on your episode on the sinking of HMS Edinburgh, the German destroyers were the Hermann Schürmann and Z-24 and Z-25. Simply from a standpoint of unit morale, I would imagine that the crew would connect more strongly with a name rather than a designation. So, at least for the time period the channel covers, the naming of German destroyers is a little bit of a blip, because in World War I, German destroyers weren't named. They had numbers and then a letter at the beginning which designated which shipyard they'd been built in. Then with the Type 1934s and up to the Type 1936s, but not the 36As, sometimes called the Narviks, the Kriegsmarine named its destroyers all of a sudden. And then with the Type 1936As or the Narviks, they went back to just using designators, although now it wasn't by a shipyard that built them, it was just Z and then an increasing number. The reason for this appears to be something to do with the outbreak of the Second World War, because all the German destroyers that were named were built and launched prior to World War II breaking out, and every ship that just had an alphanumeric designator stuck onto it was launched during the war. There is some suggestion that this was done for supposed security purposes, which to a certain extent you could argue, yes, if you've got a name that's easier to track in interceptor communications, but even the ships that had names also had hull numbers, Z1, Z2, Z3, etc. So you could just use those if you were that worried about names being identified in communication. So I'm not sure that holds water as the natural reason. It may be an official reason given by somebody or other, but I don't think that was the actual motivation. I suspect that, much like the sudden renaming of Deutschland to Lützow, because Hitler was suddenly very worried about a ship carrying the name Deutschland being sunk, that perhaps, given that destroyers of all your major surface combatants tend to be the ones that get hit and sunk the most often, that maybe someone in the Kriegsmarine, or maybe even Hitler himself, was sitting there and thinking, maybe we don't want to name our most frequently lost classes of ship after various German war heroes, only to see them sunk again very soon. That might be bad for morale, whereas Z-28 has been sunk doesn't really have as much of an impact, for pretty much the same reasons as you mentioned, that sailors might connect more with a named ship rather than a numbered ship. It certainly wasn't because the ships were getting any smaller, I'll tell you that much. And then wrapping up this half, Scott Jennings asks, in your opinion, which of the world's navies represents the greatest waste of potential, i.e. the nation had the will, the technology and the resources to become a major naval power, but due to circumstances or sheer bad luck, never quite managed to pull it off? That's a very difficult one, I would say, because if you look at the nations that had, as you mentioned, the will, the technology and the resources to become a major naval power, well, everyone who ticks all three of those boxes categorically, generally speaking, has at some point become a major naval power. They may not have become the major naval power, because someone else might have done it even better than them at the time, but they've all become a major naval power, at least as far as I can reasonably tell. There are a few where you kind of look at it and go, well, you've certainly got the technology and the resources, but you didn't become a major naval power, and that's usually due to the lack of the will part of things. So, but I would say there are probably two cases that stand out, one of which never quite got there on a global scale, at least once it was in contact with a greater expanse of various nations, and the other was of a major naval power at one point and had the capability of still being one, but kind of lost it a bit. So that would be 19th century China. China, at various points in the 19th century, did have the will from the upper echelons of society. They wanted to be a major naval power, or at least one that could stand up to the Japanese. They kind of had the technology, or at least they knew who to buy it from, and they definitely had the resources. But hilarious amounts of corruption and internal mismanagement and infighting meant that things like the Beiyang fleet never quite reached the potential they should have done. The other one would be the Spanish, because of course the Spanish were a major naval power in the 15th, 16th, and to a certain extent even the 17th centuries. But by the time you get to the late 18th and early 19th century, Spain has not entirely dropped off the radar, but is certainly a level down in naval power terms. They're still considered a significant player, but they are massively hobbled, despite having the will and indeed the need to be a major naval power to maintain their overseas empire, particularly in South America and Central America. They've definitely got the technology. They have some of the finest shipwrights in the world, especially in the Havana dockyards. And, well, thanks to the endless amounts of gold and silver they're siphoning out of South America, they've got the resources, as long as they can cause massive global inflation. So how is it that they don't dominate the planet, considering some of the designs they're able to put out? And especially because they don't have a revolution like the French, they don't decapitate their command structure either. Well, at that point, it comes down to some of the intricacies, because the Spanish, as I said, they've got really good ships. They've got, in the main, actually some pretty darn good commanders going around. And sort of in the Voyage of the Glorioso, for example, and Admiral Gravina, while he was on the losing side at Trafalgar, was not exactly a bad admiral, nor were a lot of the other Spanish admirals and captains there. Where they tended to suffer was the crew, because, as I've explained in a few other dry docks, they had this system of essentially 2-year seaborne national service, but including the time it took you to get to and from the ship, which kind of meant that you just about get a portion of your crew trained up to be fairly good at their job before they were released back home, and most of them didn't really want to be there, so your sort of enlisted crew tended to cycle quite often, which meant that their general crewmen just usually weren't up to the standard that other navies were, and therefore they struggled to maintain their position as a naval power compared to what they should have been if you looked at their capabilities on paper. And the few times, whether by circumstance or by people being volunteers, Spanish ships actually have crews that have served with either the ship in question or the navy as a whole for more than a few years, you suddenly see a quantum leap in there of particular effectiveness, but that's the exception rather than the rule. So yeah, if the Spanish had realized that actually this was a terrible idea for recruiting their crews and either improved pay and living conditions or just done something either legislatively or logistically to try and get crews to serve aboard ships for maybe even 3 or 4 years, they would have seen a massive jump in their effectiveness, which, given their fleet size, would have probably easily seen them surpass the French by quite a margin, especially after the French Revolution, and arguably potentially even have an edge over the British in a number of engagements, because like with things like Cape St. Vincent, they very often would have the numbers, and even when they didn't have the numbers, because of their ability to design large and powerful ships, they very often had the on-paper firepower advantage. So there you go. Well, that's the first half of the Patreon dry dock done. Congratulations for making it this far. It's now time to head over to part 2.